Welcome to the second session of our event celebrating an open mesh of possibilities, thinking queerness with Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick's archive. My name is Laura Micham, and I'm the director of the Sallie Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture and the curator of Gender and Sexuality History Collections for the Rubenstein Library. I want to add to the acknowledgments that Naomi Nelson made this morning. I'd like to thank the members of the Sallie Bingham Center whose hard work, creativity, and generosity made this event happen. Kelly Wooten, Cass Ostrander, Colette Harley, and our newest colleague, Ren Bickle. I would also like to thank my wonderful Rubenstein Library colleagues who are volunteering today in a multitude of ways that have made this event so successful. And thank you, Katie Carithers. Recent Bingham Center intern, exhibit curator, and a beloved member of our circle and of the Rubenstein Library over this full and formative year in which she arranged, researched, and described the majority of the artwork in the collection, including the voluminous small art objects, works on paper, ceramics, and even some of the textiles, and simultaneously curated the thoughtful, abundant, insightful, and truly beautiful exhibit that we are celebrating today. People often ask how Eve's papers came to Duke. And as sometimes happens when faculty change institutions, her files remained in her faculty office when she left in 1997. Shortly after I arrived in the early 2000s, I learned that a colleague here had had the foresight to preserve those 8 boxes of files. I was asked to look at them and decide what the next steps would be in our work with the collection. Reaching out to Eve herself seemed to be the natural thing to do. She and I exchanged emails and eventually decided that I would visit her in New York City. I wanted to bring her a gift. In one of the boxes of her office files was a bag of Duke University Press pinback buttons referencing a book, Tendencies, to promote Series Q, launched in 1993 by Eve and her co-editors, Michelle Aina Borelli, Jonathan Goldberg, and Michael Moon, to, quote, bring theoretical and interdisciplinary lens to gay and lesbian studies, approaching questions of sexuality from a queer angle. I brought a button to offer her, and she took it and promptly leaned across the table and asked me, do you have tendencies? Which is what is printed on this button. So I paused, understanding that it was not a simple question, but also understanding that I could not hesitate too long. And so my answer, doesn't everyone? She gave me a smile that seemed to suggest that my answer was a good one, and the rest of our conversation was very positive about the materials already in the library at Duke, as well as her openness to adding the rest of her collection in due course. In 2009, I began a correspondence with Hal Sedgwick about the materials in Eve's studio, her papers, books, art objects, and other documentation of her life and work that he was lovingly preserving. Before long, Hal invited me to visit him and Eve's cat, Wabi Sabi, in Eve's studio. That would be the first of many visits, not just my visits to New York, but also visits to Duke by Hal and Sarah McCary, the extraordinary writer and publisher and, of course, early archivist of Eve's papers and the director of the Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick Foundation. These visits were interspersed with hundreds of emails and phone calls, culminating in a wonderful and intense 5-day visit in July of 2019 to finish inventorying, preparing, and packing the 81 boxes that would make their way to Duke. The day before the shippers arrived, the 3 of us took pictures in front of the tall stacks of carefully labeled boxes and then celebrated with champagne in one of the many wonderful restaurants that Hal has shared with me over the years. The pandemic slowed us down a bit, but I am so glad that this celebration is happening now and here with all of you. Thank you, Hal Sedgwick and Sarah McCary, for 16 years of the best kind of collaboration, for your trust and your kindness and your extraordinary generosity as we thought and dreamt and wrote about, packed and unpacked every element of this project. It has been and continues to be a gift and an honor to work with Eve's papers and to share them with students and faculty and other researchers and to be in your orbit. Now it is my very good fortune to introduce you to our next speaker, Professor Jane Hu, who will deliver a lecture entitled How to Do Things with Sedgwick's Words. Dr. Hu is an assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Southern California. She is working on her first academic monograph, Generic Asians, which examines the long afterlife of Victorian narratives in contemporary Asian Anglophone novels. Her cultural criticism has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, and Book Forum, amongst other places. She is an assistant editor at N+1, an award-winning print and digital magazine of literature, culture, and politics. Dr. Hu is also a Sedgwickian, a member of the magical community created by Hal and Eve, consisting of their students, colleagues, friends, and intellectual descendants. She wrote a profile of Eve and Hal in the December 9th, 2015 page-turner column of The New Yorker, a space for, quote, criticism, contentions, and conversations inspired by books and the writing life. Perfect for a piece that brings the reader vividly into the room with Eve and Hal through their 40 years together in a relationship about which Hal quoted Eve from her book, A Dialogue on Love. Quote, "It's a matter of suddenly, globally knowing that another person represents your only access to some vitally transmissible truth or radiantly heightened mode of perception." Stunning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jane Hu.
Great, thank you. Oh, quick. Okay, so my talk is, I think, a little over 45 minutes, so I'm going to try to go quickly. So thank you, Laura. Oop, my goodness. For that generous introduction, and all your incredibly hard work organizing this event. Thanks also, of course, to Katie and the Sallie Bingham Center, and of course to Hal and Sarah, who sends her regrets, and the Sedgwick Foundation. And it's truly an honor to be here today. So this talk is about kinds of closeness, close reading primarily, but also other forms of closeness that might feel outside the bounds of what counts as literary criticism. Its title is a shameless riff on J.L. Austin's famous 1955 lectures on performative utterances, subsequently published as How to Do Things with Words. But it's also a riff on Sedgwick's own riffs on Austin, which she mobilized in her criticism, as well as you can see here in her pedagogy. I was here last December just going through some of the boxes that Katie described so brilliantly, and this is just, the start of one of her syllabi. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to be fairly pedagogical today and hew very closely to Sedgwick's words by close reading how she close reads. When we talk about close reading, we rarely associate it with literal physical closeness. If anything, my students seem to encounter their readings from a mediated distance, increasingly engaging them over tablets and screens. But as someone who only really begins to grasp a text after I've held it in my hands, scribbled in its margins, fondled its pages, the act of close reading has always been for me more than a metaphor. If I can beat a piece of writing and leave it untouched, then I was probably not reading all that closely. The first time I read Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, one of my favorite close readers, was over a computer screen. My college professor, no chance, had recommended her influential essay, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, which one can nowadays find online. I began reading the essay itself about the politics and stakes of close reading until midway through, I realized the PDF format could not sustain the kind of annotational damage I felt the piece demanded from me. I printed it out and proceeded to scrawl all over it, underlining critical phrases, circling keywords, though by the end, my marginalia consisted almost solely of hearts, stars, and the periodic triple exclamation mark. Sedgwick's literary criticism provoked not only my strong personal feelings, a far from uncommon experience I'd soon learn, but also the fuzzier feeling that to read criticism closely was to bring it somehow personally, materially close. I learned this from reading Sedgwick, whose close readings dare to sidle up to their textual objects with intense, sometimes even inappropriate intimacy. In the introduction to her 2003 essay collection, Touching Feeling, Sedgwick describes the book as offering what she calls, quote, tools and techniques for non-dualistic thought and pedagogy, end quote. The collection's very organizational structure models this, divided into 5 chapters that don't follow a linear plot or argumentative telos. Sidestepping a hermeneutics of suspicion that aim to get beneath or behind the hidden meaning of texts, Touching Feeling sought instead to get, in Sedgwick's words, beside them. As its title suggests, she writes in the introduction still, the most salient preposition in Touching Feeling is probably beside. Beside is an interesting preposition because there's nothing very dualistic about it. A number of elements may lie alongside one another, though not an infinity of them, end quote. While Sedgwick's critical approach of the beside is field agnostic, right, it's not specific to reading literature, I want to suggest today that beside is nonetheless an especially salient preposition also for thinking about close reading, in which one brings together a number of textual elements, though not an infinity of them. And as Katie was speaking, I was also thinking that it could also be a way of describing the archives, but that's besides the point. Okay. So more specifically, I want to suggest how Sedgwick's beside might help orient our approach to her own body of work, which now, of course, does include the archives. When I encountered Sedgwick in the winter of 2011, she had been dead for just over 2 years, and I wanted nothing but to get as close as possible to her. Obsessions, she writes in the 1993 edition of Between Men, are the most durable form of intellectual capital, and Sedgwick was one of mine. Over time, I've relinquished the juvenile fantasy that I might, through some magical convergence of repair, hope, and love, to use some of her keywords, either conjure Sedgwick back to life or myself back in time. Though I've yet to relinquish the felicitous, even magical effects of her literary criticism of how she does things with words. One of Sedgwick's key insights about Austen was simply to emphasize how his initial classificatory distinction between what he calls the performative versus the constative, or words that do things versus words that merely describe them, how that distinction is itself undone over the course of his lectures. As Austen writes toward the end of How to Do Things with Words, quote, every genuine speech act is both, end quote. Austen progressively dilated his theoretical terms throughout his lectures, a licensed loosening up of his own critical concepts that Sedgwick's work also models. And this talk focuses on one key essay, the first in Touching Feeling, titled Shame, Theatricality, and Queer Performativity, Henry James's The Art of the Novel, which is adapted, as I'm sure many of you know, from an essay published 10 years prior in the inaugural issue of GLQ in 1993. So I'm interested in what happens to Sedgwick's close reading of James over the course of this decade, especially because 1993 is when, as David Koenig examines in a brilliant forthcoming essay, the word queer starts appearing in Sedgwick's criticism, marking what Koenig describes as, and now I'm quoting from the forthcoming essay, quote, her reputational shift from literary critic, the author of 3 highly regarded books in that field, to queer theorist, one who would continue to employ literary texts as the occasion for theorization, but whose audience soon outstripped the relatively restricted group of readers interested in fine-grained analyses of William Thackeray, Henry James, Herman Melville, et al., end quote. Like Koenig, I find myself stuck somewhere in or around what he calls the long 1993 of queer studies, a critical hinge in Sedgwick's career between what we might call the early and late work. Yet even as Sedgwick's reputation shifts from literary critic to queer theorist, the distinction is ultimately overstated, I want to suggest when you look at our close readings. We might say that every genuine Sedgwick essay is at least both. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the close reading of her close reading. And as a disclaimer, sections of what you're about to hear are drawn from a forthcoming essay on close reading and rereading and really the constant, even obsessive circling around a work of literary criticism that grabs you partly because it eludes you. And to be sure, Sedgwick's essay is somewhat atypical as a literary close reading, right? Not only is it a close reading of a renowned fiction writer's nonfiction, it's also, in a way, a close reading of what is already a close reading. James's prefaces, written for the New York edition of his work, right, show the older writer rereading and reflecting on his earlier writing. Subsequently collected, these prefaces, right, and published in 1934 as The Art of the Novel, the prefaces are now considered canonical texts of novel theory. Yet if James's prefaces are often cited as about the novel form writ large, their global theories are inseparable from the specific scenes and settings of James's fiction, and indeed, this is part of Sedgwick's argument in the essay, the specific body of James himself. Living up to his title, The Master, James is known to have authored some of the most difficult, dense works of literature in the English language. But in Sedgwick's hands, he's brought down and somewhat dirtily to earth. Sedgwick's close reading of James's abstruse and aestheticizing language gets up close and personal with the master himself, fixating in particular on how James's bowel movements impacted his prose style. Connecting James's linguistic abstractions to his literal ass remains one of the essay's most memorable moves, partly because the gesture seems so counterintuitive, if not perverse or simply unfounded. But if Sedgwick's redirection of critical attention makes you blush, that's partly the point. An organizing theme of shame, theatricality, and queer performativity is shame, an affect that Sedgwick understands as crucial for getting deep into James. Shame informs not just the content of Sedgwick's argument, but also the experience, we might say feeling, of reading it. I've personally felt shame recently revisiting this essay because despite considering myself both a Sedgwickian and Jamesian, I'm regularly flustered by it. The essay's metabolization of James's personal shame through his chronic constipation, closeted gayness, and creative output is virtuosic, absolutely. A masterclass in critical proficiency and dexterity. But when I try to reiterate Sedgwick's argument, I become flushed with frustration, quickly lapsing into convoluted circles, trying to capture the complexity of her moves, the full terrain of her expertise. You'll just have to read it yourself, I often concede. That's because even before arriving at Sedgwick's close reading, I find myself struggling to stage the coordinates of her theoretical setup, which, as we'll see a bit today, is extensive, right? Ranging from psychoanalytical theories of shame to biographical context around James's queerness, to the basic premise of many of his novels, which, right, the prefaces opine on. It also asks that we understand Sedgwick's investments in the formation of queer theory in the late 1980s, and the history of the AIDS crisis during which she wrote much of her scholarship. Part of what makes reading Sedgwick here and elsewhere so thrilling is how she takes a writer as difficult and complex as James and seeks to match that difficulty. This thrill is further amplified by how the drama of Sedgwick's difficulty sneaks up on you. The essay's opening is, in fact, I would say deceptively simple, beginning with what we're often advised to avoid in literary criticism, the personal anecdote. Here's the first paragraph, and I don't have time to read it out loud, but I will be referencing parts of it. So, in an essay with Henry James in the title, Sedgwick's essay, opens not by telling us about Henry James, but about Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. She begins by recounting the experience of repeatedly looking for the World Trade Center in the weeks following 9/11, only to be met with their absence. Turning away, the paragraph ends. Shame was what I would feel. Sedgwick's essay sets the scene with an anecdote that's itself about a change of scenery, a southward vista that she knows is now gone, yet can't look away from. And the more she keeps looking back for, quote, the familiar sight of the pre-September 11 Twin Towers, end quote, the more shame she feels when she finds it, quote, of course, still gone, end quote. Shame, as an affect, hinges not on a single scene, but on the contrast between scenes. Like my renewed disorientation each time I return to Sedgwick's essay, my shame emerges from the gap between feeling like I know this essay well and realizing that perhaps I don't know it at all. There's a kind of disarming vulnerability, even stupidity, in how Sedgwick begins her essay. Her initial anecdote about shame makes me feel in ways vicariously ashamed on her behalf. Sedgwick, however, soon disrupts my initial impressions. Regarding the despoiled view, she says, of the post-9/11 Manhattan skyline, she goes on to write that, quote, though it was I who felt the shame, it wasn't especially myself I was ashamed of. It would be closer to say I was ashamed for the estranged and denuded skyline. Such feelings interlined, of course, the pride, solidarity, and grief that also bound me to the city. Sedgwick's shame is something personally felt, though it's not of herself she's personally ashamed. Instead, shame unfolds as something she feels for the skyline that sits alongside other feelings of pride, solidarity, and grief. In clarifying her sense of shame for the scene, moreover, Sedgwick also describes herself as moving, right, she uses the word closer to a more precise description of her experience. And in finding closer ways to say what she feels, her description of the scene here also approaches a close reading of it. What I love about these opening paragraphs is how seamlessly Sedgwick moves from anecdote to analysis, from on-the-ground description to high-level theorization, from personal shame to nothing more and nothing less than the sky itself, defamiliarized in terms of hapless visibility, shockingly compelling theatricality. There's something also deftly pedagogical at play here. For if we consider scene setting as often the first and seemingly simplest step of close reading, Sedgwick shows how to set the scene is always already to begin to close read. Her unfolding of personal scenes or personal shame, moreover, is strategic, given, as she's theorized elsewhere, shame's relational nature, right? So here, through anecdotal scene setting, right, where she keeps staging the difference or the gap between her various experiences of looking towards the Manhattan skyline, her essay shows that slippery edge between the personal and the literary critical. When Sedgwick finally turns then to James 6 dense pages later, she begins by resetting the scene with an analogous personal anecdote. And I'm not going to read it, but we'll be referencing it. So little finger, it's like not even a new paragraph, but sort of a new section break. So as with her own opening anecdote, Sedgwick introduces James's prefaces by describing not just when and where he wrote them, but by emphasizing how he felt while writing them, surrounded by the looming threat of embarrassment and shame. In writing the prefaces to the New York edition, James was already trying to contextualize his own writing, right? But Sedgwick's essay draws the curtain back even further to provide the unhappy circumstances surrounding James's self-contextualization. For James, the risks of reissuing his collected works were soon to be realized. The New York edition bombed, drawing, quote, the blankest of non-recognizing responses from any reader, end quote, sending him into a depressive shame spiral. For Sedgwick, it's important, though, to read the prefaces as what she says in the most active, imaginable relation to shame, because that shame filter radically changes how she close reads them. So when she turns to the actual language of the prefaces, it takes a while. Her shame filter picks up on scenes where James gets intimate, even indulgent with his past self, scenes where he appears, you could say, to come beside himself. In particular, Sedgwick spotlights instances where James approaches his earlier work as though addressing his inner child. She used the pop psychology language of the inner child. I think it's also cited in one of the letters in the archive right now. So the inner child, right, is a recurring figure that Sedgwick describes as, quote, opening out a rich landscape of relational possibilities, especially around issues of shame, end quote. In fact, Sedgwick notes how James often describes his juvenilia as though they were literal children, vicariously referring them to as for instance, uncanny brood, awkward infants, and the unlucky or unlikely child, end quote. And crucially, she writes, the speaking self of the prefaces does not attempt to merge with the potentially shaming or shame figurations of its younger self, right? So again, like her opening anecdote, that the staging, keeping that distance is important, that relational distance. So speaking self, the prefaces doesn't attempt to merge with its younger self, younger fictions, younger heroes. Its attempt is to love them, that love is shown to occur both in spite of shame and more remarkably through it, right? So again, why the shame filter needs to be there. What Sedgwick calls the, quote, sanctioned intergenerational flirtation, end quote, between James and his earlier work, which is to say his younger self, quote, represents a sustained chord in the New York edition, end quote. To give readers a sense of its ongoingness, Sedgwick cites extensively from the prefaces, presenting scene after scene in which this relation gets staged and then restaged. And in doing so, her analysis also channels the sustained rhythms and chords of James's prose, of its linguistic texture. So something notable about the essay, at least to those that I've spoken who have read it, is that while not everyone remembers exactly how all its argumentative moves go, they almost all remember how long it is, which is how I would describe a lot of James novels. Okay, so there's, for example, which I love. So there's, for example, James writing, and I'm going to give you a few quotes that she's quoting from the preface. So there's, for example, James writing about the writing of the American, which he compares to those artless schoolboys, or James writing about the writing of the Turn of the Screw, in which he says, quote, this young man on whom 100 ingenious touches are thus lavished, end quote. Or James reflecting on his bachelor, George Stransom, from the altar. The quote there that I pulled is, quote, my attested predilection for poor sensitive gentlemen almost embarrasses me as I march, end quote. These scenes of pederastic revision, as Sedgwick calls them, might appear surprising or a stretch, especially when put in such eroticizing terms. But as she proliferates examples, right, as she puts them beside each other, as I've just tried to do in even more compressed form, it becomes hard to unsee how James's inner child permeates these prefaces. This is one of the magic tricks of a felicitously enacted close reading. What begins as perhaps perverse, even counterintuitive, ends up feeling, if not always inevitable, then at least obvious. For Sedgwick, it's important, too, that James's paternalistic relation to his earlier work is obvious, because it allows us to see how he's no longer ashamed, is in fact what she calls unchained by the time of the prefaces. In embracing his inner child, anyway, James takes oh, no, that's not right. There we go. Okay, in embracing his inner child, James takes reparenting or reissue as a strategy for dramatizing and integrating shame in the sense of rendering this potentially paralyzing affect, narratively, emotionally, and performatively productive. So such a reading, right, kind of already constitutes a kind of argument, one that might very well end there, and in fact, in the initial GLQ version of the essay, it sort of does. When it appears a decade later in Touching Feeling, everything about it is longer. That said, the bulk of the essay and the part that significantly expands in the revision hones in on the subheading, right, that stays the same. Henry James's The Art of the Novel remains indelibly the literary text that enables Sedgwick to work through her thinking on affect, queer, and performance theory, all then emerging disciplines that she played no small part in building. Sedgwick's revision seems, moreover, to have taken more than just a page out of James's prefaces, insofar as her reissue of her prior work is also narratively, emotionally, and performatively productive. In returning to James's rereadings of his earlier work, Sedgwick ultimately returns to reread her own, expanding on yet another essay on James, this time from Epistemology of the Closet. That essay, you might recall, features a footnote about a passage from James's notebook written just months before he started work on the New York edition, where he describes his writing process through a long, extended metaphor. That's the footnote, and I am going to read this. Okay, so I sit here, after long weeks, at any rate, in front of my arrears, with an inward accumulation of material of which I feel the wealth. Everything sinks in, nothing is lost. Everything abides and fertilizes and renews its golden promise, making me think with closed eyes of the deep and grateful longing when, in the full summer days of Lamb House, my long, dusty adventure over, I shall be able to plunge my hand, my arm, in deep and far up to the shoulder, into the heavy bag of remembrance, of suggestion, of imagination, of art, and fish out every little figure and felicity, every fact and fancy that can be to my purpose. These things are all packed away now, thicker than I can penetrate, deeper than I can fathom. And there let them rest for the present in their sacred, cool darkness till they will begin to gleam and glitter, and take form like the gold and jewels of a mine. So Sedgwick quotes this entire passage again in Touching Feeling, promoting it from footnote to the essay's main body because it, she writes there, quote, still seems to me the best condensation of what these prefaces press us to recognize as James's most characteristic and fecund relationship to his own anal eroticism, end quote. Sedgwick's footnote in epistemology previously glossed this essay in terms of what she called fisting as écriture, right? Fisting as writing. Though this time around, in Touching Feeling, she explains how the context of the prefaces brings out other saliences equally strongly, and specifically, she notes around the theme of wealth and parturition, or childbirth. So Sedgwick, having sat on this passage for over a decade, now dives in with a close reading of James's densely packed fisting metaphor that's itself elaborately dense. And again, if I would just perform a reading of the entire essay if I had time, but this is just a glimmer of some of the sort of introductional close reading where she connects James's fisting imagery to Pope's Dunciad in order to show how, quote, the ultimate in abjection and gross out in Pope's poem gets turned, quote, under the pressure of James's brooding to become a virtually absolute symbol of imaginative value, right, represented by the gleam and glitter, the gold and the jewels. In Sedgwick's hands, James's fisting metaphor transforms from a blocking anal fixation into a generative obsession that's rich in more ways than one. The more she close reads the prefaces through this framework, the more she sees how all James touches might turn to gold. In fact, her rereading is so generative that it produces a doubling effect, leading her to note a number of doubled spatialities in the prefaces, inside and out, right, sort of dramatized here being one of them, frontal and interior being another, or in the case of recto and verso, she writes how these two terms, which appear throughout the prefaces, become, quote, an anatomical double entendre whose interest and desirability James, and I can only join him in this is Sedgwick can only join James in this, whose interest appears by this time to have experienced as inexhaustible, end quote. And so such inexhaustible interpretive richness is perhaps best crystallized in James's reference to two sides of a coin or medallion. And I'm going to give two examples because I feel like even as I'm listening to myself describe what's happening here in the essay, it's getting like a little fuzzy, it's getting a little, I'm feeling myself like getting lost in the weeds. And what's so magical about this essay is that at any point where I start to drift, she comes back and gives, more than one typically concrete example. The close reading like suddenly brings what she's trying to convey about what she's seeing in the prefaces to light. So, riches. Okay, so here's her citing James's preface to Wings, where he describes the novel's two plots as sides of an engraved and fingered coin. And then down the page, same page, James is writing about what Maisie knew in terms of, quote, that bright, hard metal of so strange an alloy, one face of which is somebody's right and ease, and the other somebody's pain and wrong. So you're seeing already, like, there's more doubled face and back, recto and verso. There's many sort of dual or doubled spatialities throughout that she's sort of picking up on. Okay, so, and here, I'm not gonna read it, but this was in the archives and it seemed too good to not present it here. I think this was from Zix, which again, I think that's the one syllabus that's in the exhibit right now. And, it's not the same way James or Sedgwick makes gold, but I do like that at the very end, they say, gold flakes after this sort of chemical distillation process, fine gold flakes should appear at the bottom. If they do not, you have done something wrong and should start over. That's really good, and also the note, because of the poisonous fumes given off during this process, it's wise to eat bread thickly, spread with butter to lessen the effect. So again, something about making gold and the physical labor, the bodily labor that goes into that. Okay, so for me, it's like Sedgwick has discovered a new portal into the prefaces, a key that unlocks this other side of Henry James that allows us to read the master's prose as figuratively and literally influenced by his own struggles with what she calls digestive accumulation and manual penetration, or to put it crudely, shitting and fisting. Over the course of the essay, Sedgwick is aware that she's somewhat gotten anally fixated, right, on James's own anal fixation, right? That becomes clear at some point, right? All too clear, right? And even admitting how, quote, this thematic emphasis may differ from a received understanding of James's aesthetic preoccupations, end quote. That's where she quotes the William James letter, which I'm not going to read. So her obsessive tunneling into this line of reading is so palpable and contagious that she almost needs to stop herself from reading closely too much. She writes, to trace the ramifications of these images through the prefaces would involve quoting from literally every single page of them. A more efficient approach would be perhaps to offer something brief in the way of lexicon of a few main words and semantic clusters through which the fisting image works. And so perhaps appropriately, Sedgwick's seemingly inexhaustible reading of James's verbal productivity ends with a kind of necessary compression, leading her to burrow around what she calls semantic clusters in the preface, right? A prominent one is right, which Sedgwick draws from the Latin for rect and connects to wordplay throughout James's prose with rectum and recto, or right as straight versus left as wrong, or indeed queer. Another is hand, with all its tactile eroticizing and fisting associations. A favorite of James, and I imagine of Sedgwick's, and certainly of mine, is fond. And this is just one of the paragraphs where she starts collecting instances that relate to fond etymologically or in the prefaces. So there's more than just this. Right, fond with its iterations of foundation and fun. This family of words, Sedgwick writes, positively swarm in James's late writing, as if such syllables enjoyed some privileged access to the raw essence of fantasy, end quote. And then here are some others, some which I've already noted and others that I haven't. I'm trying to be synecdochal about this. Okay, so the irony of all this, of course, is that in moving towards this more efficient approach, as she calls it, Sedgwick continues to gather new semantic clusters. To illustrate James's struggle to keep compression rich, if not better still, to keep accretions compressed, Sedgwick paradoxically draws James out further. She lingers and luxuriates on his sentences anew. She repeats and reframes them, and in doing so, begins to loosen up so many of the localized instances of the so-called fisting image. Though what I find most Sedgwickian here is that as she emphasizes the generative nature of James's wordplay, she also opens it up for readers to participate in the fun of close reading. The above are some of her terms that particularly clamor for inclusion in this little lexicon, though there could be many more, she writes, and indeed, any reader of even these few passages is likely to be able to generate a list of other repeated, magnetic, and often enigmatic signifiers that would need to be added, end quote. Again, this modeling seems to me exemplary of her pedagogy, which demonstrates by doing, right, even performing, a kind of reading that goes a long way, right, keeps going on and on and on. And again, these are from the archives. We can look at them in like the 5 or 10 minutes we have for Q&A, but this is a draft, I think probably in anticipation of, based on what there's no date, but it seems like it's working towards the GLQ essay, which takes out the epigraph, but I like that it's there here. And then these are from the notes for The Art of the Novel. And it's simple and it's also not, how she's sort of just creating lists, doing the step one of sort of the semantic clusters, And again, there's many more pages of this. I just selected some that might relate to things that I've been spotlighting, the performatives. And yeah, I think they're largely set in alphabetical order in the archives. Okay. So toward the end of the essay, Sedgwick emphasizes that her extensive, capacious, seemingly exhaustive reading of James's prefaces is nonetheless still just a partial reading, right? And she's very careful to clarify that it's partial, not because the reading is organized around sexuality, she says, but because it's organized around the semantic unit. This distinction is striking because it's where the essay, for me, really dramatizes the perilous entanglements between Sedgwick's work and role as a queer theorist, a theorist of sexuality, and her work and training as a literary critic. You know, when I first read it many, many years ago, I used to delight, I think as many of us do, in how the essay takes James's bowel movements so seriously and literally, right? That's just fun. But I find that its real theoretical climax is when Sedgwick takes the time, before we all get too carried away, to prize her formal reading of the semantic cluster aside from the figural reading of James's sexuality. The essay's close fixation on specific semantic clusters, and moreover, the semantic cluster as a unit of analysis, makes obvious that James's words matter, despite and because of how many he wrote. And his words matter in ways that may or may not line up with his sexual orientation or even his theory of the novel. To that last point, Sedgwick acknowledges how such obsessive fixation might distract ultimately from the argumentative flow or content of James's prefaces as novel theory, right? Like the essay doesn't actually tell us that much about the art of the novel at the level of theory of what it says. At the same time, you know, Sedgwick's close reading might ultimately be more in spirit, certainly more in style and texture, with James's own fixations in the prefaces. Another way to put this might be that there's at least two different kinds of queerness in James's prose here. At a semantic level, queer, as in wrong, as in left, or deviation, exists not only at the level of sexual content, but also at the level of a formal reading, a kind of fond rhythm, a fun way of keeping attention. This is literary criticism that dramatizes close reading as a practice that plays with form, not just in addition to, but almost at the expense of content. A way of reading that reshuffles our understanding of canonical texts by clustering a number of elements alongside one another, though not an infinity of them. Sedgwick's close reading does what many of the best close readings do. It loosens things up and lets us see them anew. So in the spirit of productivity, I have two endings. That could have been ending one, and I read fast enough, so I'm on. Okay, so my second ending is I first met Sedgwick, Hal, not Eve, at an event not unlike this one. The conference celebrating the 30-year anniversary of Between Men at CUNY almost exactly 10 years ago. By then, I was already an enthusiastically self-identified Sedgwickian, though it would have been more accurate to describe me as a Sedgwick fangirl, a tardy groupie who had been running late even to the many after parties and was just thrilled to be in a room of people who knew her. If Sedgwick had been, in a way, reading James for filth, then I had, for a long time, been reading Sedgwick as self-help. There's nothing necessarily wrong about that, except for the fact that while I had never met Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, her writing made me feel like I had. This seems to be as much its promise as its potential peril. How much of that sense of intimacy was the product of a warm, narcissistic circuit of my own magical, wishful reading? For many of those who've written reflections on their relationship to reading or being under the enthralling power of Sedgwick's words, and I've read so many of these trying to get close to her, there's often a moment where they reflect on their younger selves and stage some scene of reevaluation, whether framed as critical distancing or disavowal or renewed deference or devotion. Oftentimes, also, there seems to float alongside these reconsiderations something like a sense of shame, felt not necessarily by the writer in that moment, but perhaps for their younger self. And again, I'm not sure that's necessarily bad or wrong. As Sedgwick and James both show us, such risks of self-exposure can also be richly rewarding. Shame, like close reading, is never fixed or final. So I'm going to conclude by returning to where we started. Obsessions are the most durable form of intellectual capital, writes Sedgwick in the preface to the 1993 edition of Between Men. The sentence that follows is, quote, "So perhaps it's folly to second-guess them, even though it seems patent that the intellectual enablements of this obsessionally motivated project were also interlined with profound blockages," end quote. In that second sentence, I hear at least a small chord of Sedgwick's own ambivalence toward this much-quoted sentence, right? And perhaps, perhaps it's because it's 1993, right? It's the long 1993 of queer theory, and something a shift is happening, perhaps. For me, when I read it now, my reservations are less around the potential folly of committing so brazenly to one's obsessions, especially if they produce writer's block, and more around what it means to equate obsessions with intellectual capital, and to suggest that equivalence as one of endurance or a kind of commercial or economic durability that can withstand shifts in political and disciplinarian and emotional weather, right, which is just to say time. And then, I didn't really notice this, it might be obvious to everyone else in this room, which is great, but when I was rereading the introduction to Touching Feeling for this, I realized that she says it again. She says, I'm fond of observing, well, she kind of says it again. I'm fond of observing how obsession is the most durable form of intellectual capital. And it's this little moment of second-order reflection, right, of the older Sedgwick fondly observing the persistence or durability of the earlier phrase that inserts friction into that initial older sentiment, right? And doing so loosens it up. For a long time, I wanted to get as close as I could to Sedgwick, short of some Gothic plot twist. Though with time, I'm almost grateful to have met her only through her words. For now, I find myself happiest deep in those fine-grained analyses that Koenig describes of her literary criticism, where I'm still trying to get close, and perhaps at times even too close, to her sentences, with hopes that if I come up beside them in just the right way, I'll not only better understand how she does things with words, but moreover, be able to do things with them in turn. Thank you. Okay, cool, I got it, yeah, got it. This one, sure. Okay, we can just look at some.
So let's thank Jane Hugh one more time. We have time actually for a brief Q&A followed by a brief coffee break. So if anybody would like to ask a question.
Or if you want to look at the art, their iCarvals, there's so much good stuff.
Robyn?
Yeah, could you just say more about the long 1993?
Oh, yeah.
1993 of the clear
1993. Yeah. David sent me this amazing essay that's coming out soon-ish in New Literary History, I think. And so in that essay, he's really thinking about, he's sort of doing a version of what he does in the melodrama essay where he also kind of, that's the surface reading essay where he's sort of like walking backwards from the representation special issue on surface reading by Best and Marcus, and then Rita Felsky, and then paranoid reading, right? So it's a version where he's kind of thinking through a range of Sedgwick's work, and especially 1993, where queer starts popping up in the scholarship, and that's not it's sort of a triadic essay. So he also does Joan Scott, and then he ends with a Delaney I think, short story. But he's really thinking about like what is happening in 1993 where the word queer takes on greater, public presence and kind of becomes this like launching point or vector from which there's I guess I would describe it without, kind of butchering or scooping the essay, where it's sort of, there's a license loosening up, I suppose. That's sort of part of the argument, and where queer, the carefulness of the early work and its attentiveness to the fact of a queer readership gets perhaps dropped a little bit afterwards. So he's sort of thinking about that as like a hinge, and I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
I'm partly interested because Between Men is republished in '93, right? And it's not a book that was, regarded as being a work of queer theory.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Sedgwick's work is with Epistemology of the Closet in 1990. So I was just wondering, like, what
Oh, yeah. Oh, where does it start? Yeah, I think it's really,
specificity of 1993?
I think tendencies. Yeah, tendencies. Yeah, the publication of tendencies. Yeah.
Is that a are you suggesting through a re-chronologizing of queer theories and its origins by moving us to a different Sedgwick set of texts, both going backwards, right, that brings Between Men forward, but also thinking about tendencies and its centrality?
Yeah. I think that, well, maybe here I can like disenmesh or disentangle myself. Yeah, I think for Koenig, it really is the first three books up until Epistemologies, which are pre-1993. And then I think he is citing a lot from Queer now, especially the sort of drama of the opening anecdote and the statistics around children dying, right? Or children not being born. So he's really focusing on tendencies, whereas I'm sort of using the long 1993 that he's drawing out there to think about, to push back a little bit on that and to think about actually the long 1993 cannot be pinpointed so closely to tendencies, right? Because there's so much back and forth revision, right? So maybe that, yeah.
Thank you. One more question?
Just really quick, so I can write down. What's the name of this forthcoming article that you were referencing?
I'll tell you the title. It's like a long title called like The Beautiful, Gorgeous. I mean, I think one thing that I will say about that essay that it really is incredible is that so much of, even if there is a degree of strong ambivalence by Koenig towards, some of the work, or at least the shift, so much of how that gets articulated, and I think that this also happens a little bit in the melodrama essay for those of you who have read it, is that it's still part of what feels difficult about disentangling argument from feeling is that so much of it is about quoting from Sedgwick's writing, right? So much of it is about putting Koenig's word, like he's doing a semantic cluster reading of some of her work, right? And both pointing to like, what does that mean? I'm being swept away by this beautiful phrase, and then at the same time, we're being swept away by the beautiful phrase, right? So, but yeah, I think the title, I could look it up, but the title is something, no, it's in my other email, I'm sorry, but it's something like Gorgeous. It's about something that I sort of was interested in is how much he cites, how much Sedgwick uses the word gorgeous. So it's also about like, her prose style and sort of falling in love with her prose style as well. But yeah, I'll find it. But it's forthcoming. It'll be great, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. So if all went to plan, where you found your lunches, you will now find coffee and tea. And I would request that you come back in about 10 minutes' time for our next session, our exhibit roundtable. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. You're such an obedient group. We actually, when we were setting up the times, I was like, nobody ever finishes a coffee break, on time. And here you are. So, which is great. I'm Robyn Wiegman, and it's a real pleasure to be able to moderate this panel, but also to have been able to be part of this, of the exhibit and the symposium and the entire project, actually, of thinking with Laura about the Sedgwick archive. The boxes that she talked about that were left, that she found in the basement when she got hired, that had been left in Eve's office, she sent me an email and said, we have these boxes, that were in Eve's office. Will you come and look at them? So I have the pleasure, had the pleasure of getting to kind of go, yeah, I think this is important too. And I, for a couple years after that, I had some of my graduate student research assistants did some work with those boxes, including one of our speakers today. So anyway, I wanted to just say a few words about that. I'm teaching the course that I'm teaching, which is an undergraduate, graduate course, so it's mostly graduate students. And I see some of you here. You can kind of like, hello, yes. Barbara, you have to raise your hand. Barbara, I found out, she didn't even tell us this, that you did translation for the polyp piece. Yes, so anyway, there's many ways that we've been involved. One of the projects that the students in the class are doing are called archive diaries, in which they're going to be writing about their experience. They're required to do 10 hours at minimum, in the archives, in the boxes, and then to write about the experience, not just the content of the boxes, but also the experience of being, sort of in the archive with Eve, and to think about the objects. And then we're going to read them all together so that we can get each of us can have a broader sense of what's in the archive. And one of the major issues that we've been thinking about, does have to do with the archive as a form of mediation, right? Like that. And Hal and I are meeting later this week. I have some questions about how much did Eve save? How much organization was, did she actually organize the materials, right? So that we can think about the layers of mediation through which the objects come to us. And obviously the exhibit is a form of mediation, of curation and mediation. So we've been thinking a lot about that, and about also the relationship between memorialization and memory and remembering, and the notion of memory, and what it means for new generations to sort of inherit a memory that many of us are enjoying today because we haven't seen each other for a long time, but we've known each other. I mean, Michael Moon just reminded me that he was with Eve on the bridge in Chicago at the MLA, which I have written about because Tom Yingling introduced me to Eve. And I hadn't remembered, Michael, that you were there. So we are having some old folks memory lane time. But this panel is actually about the young people who inherit a legacy and inherit a set of objects and forms of mediation that they have to, think through, right? Not always to take necessarily our relation to the objects as the only relation that is possible. And one wants to do that because Eve's demand has always, or I should say in that sentence, Sedgwick's demand has always been to keep and to continue thinking, and to think in relationship to objects that become impersonal, even as much as they are personal, because the inheritance is an impersonal inheritance as opposed to a personalized one. So those are some of the things I just wanted to say about the class. And I'm going to introduce our speakers all at once, and then they're going to give us their comments and their object. So Cole Adams, who's going to speak first, is a Ph.D. candidate in the literature program and is getting a certificate in the gender, sexuality, and feminist studies program at Duke. He's completing a dissertation about personal and political attachments to poetry in a time of both the method wars, and the culture wars. And what's been kind of great but also tragic in talking with you about your project is just the revivification of the culture wars at this moment. So it's not just retrospective about the culture wars, but what these present ones are. And that's another really important moment we had at the beginning of the semester, where students were reading Sedgwick and realizing how similar the moment of the late 80s and 90s in which she was writing, about AIDS feels to the present, right? We have another pandemic, we have a culture war, we have multiple genocides happening, we have censorship, et cetera, and so I think some of the students said that they took hope from the idea that we'd been here before, and that there's a way to learn what it means to be living in a time of catastrophe, apocalypse, and emergency, and it's a challenge to find hope. I mean, I think Nash was talking about today. Cole's object is he's going to discuss an unpublished poetry manuscript titled "Traceable, Salient, Thirsty," which Sedgwick tried and failed to find a publisher for around 1977. This could have been her first book of poems, or first book of any kind. He's notes the poems were written between 1973 and 77, during and just after her Ph.D. at Yale. Most of the poems went uncollected until Sedgwick chose to publish them in Fat Art, Thin Art in 1994. He'll speak first. And then Katie Carithers, who you've already introduced, and we have to thank her deeply for being willing to be on this panel today, because we did have two people who were scheduled who had to drop out. So she spent the weekend preparing to be on this panel because, basically at the last minute. So, just kudos to you and everything that you have done for this project, Katie. Katie, she was already introduced, but some of you weren't here this morning, is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in English and pursuing the certificate in feminist studies with the gender studies program as well. Her dissertation project focuses on representations of desire in 19th century British novels, and her research interests include queer theory, contemporary gender and sexuality studies, post-colonial studies, and psychoanalysis. Interesting. Her object is the polyp fabric sculpture that we're using as the visual object on all of the advertising for the symposium. Which is made out of multicolored strips of shibori fabric, imprinted with text from Proust, gathered, tied, and knotted to resemble a sea anemone or a coral polyp. Katie's going to offer her thoughts about what working with this kind of hybrid visual textile book form is like from a curatorial, archival, researcher, and literary studies perspective. And then our final speaker is Julien Fischer, who's a Mellon postdoctoral fellow and lecturer in feminist gender and sexuality studies at Stanford University and a candidate psychoanalyst based in Oakland, California. Julien's scholarship engages the nexus of sexuality, writing, and the body. His current book project, The Lure of Origins, Sexology, and the Trans-Autobiographical Mandate, traces the relationship between autobiography and the clinical invention of transsexuality. At Stanford, Julien teaches in queer, feminist, and trans studies, and Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis. And I should say that he's the one I was referring to as a research assistant who worked on the first 8 boxes. The first 8 boxes in the collection are the ones that were found in the office. And is also a graduate of the, I noticed that you didn't put that here. And it's also, that's interesting, no kudos for the program in literature at Duke. That's where his PhD is from, okay, from 2023. All right. So today, Julien will be speaking about the 1999 book, A Dialogue on Love. I mean, it's so interesting because we didn't think that it would make its appearance. We thought epistemology was going to be the touchstone, so it's fascinating that it's a dialogue on love. Sedgwick's a lyrical account of her experience in psychotherapy. The book chronicles Eve's encounter with her therapist, Shannon, whose transformative effects she then addresses in quite another form to us, her readers. Composed of both poetry and prose, A Dialogue on Love transgresses the boundaries of genre and form and offers an unexpected glimpse into the queerest of archives, the archive of the unconscious. So please welcome our speakers.
Hello, everyone. Okay. So to start off, I want to be a little bit sincere. I've been reading Sedgwick for what feels to me like a long time, so being up here feels a little bit surreal, but it's also one of the few things I can imagine being totally invested in at this moment, and I just want to thank everyone whose work has made this event possible. The object I'm going to talk about today is an unpublished poetry manuscript titled Traceable, Salient, Thirsty, which currently lives in box number 17 in Sedgwick's papers, alongside an assortment of other in-progress, nearly final drafts. The manuscript includes poems Sedgwick wrote between 1973 and 1977, years that include time she spent in New Haven as a Ph.D. student at Yale and in Ithaca as a postdoc in English and creative writing at Cornell. In 1977, Sedgwick tried and ultimately failed to find a publisher for Traceable, Salient, Thirsty, which would have been her first book of poems and first book of any kind. Her revised dissertation, The Coherence of Gothic Conventions, ended up taking the latter title, while the privilege of the former would go to 1994's poetry collection, Fat Art, Thin Art. Readers would recognize in section 2 of Fat Art, Thin Art, however, most, though not all, of the poems that constitute the unpublished Traceable manuscript. While Sedgwick continued to write poetry and even teach undergraduate poetry workshops into the 80s, it was in the intervening decade that Sedgwick became known not primarily for her poetry, what she calls in her memoir, A Dialogue on Love, her first love and first self, but instead for her criticism, especially between men, epistemology of the closet, and tendencies. In the period then that corresponded roughly with Sedgwick's emergence as a leading voice in the then new discourse dubbed queer theory, and as a guardian for one of its earliest institutional homes here at Duke, she was nursing a deeply frustrating and extremely painful poetry writing block that lasted the better part of a decade. Facing down the unyieldingness of those invisible brick walls, as Sedgwick described that block, she left the Traceable manuscript behind, publishing just a couple of standalone poems from it. And she seemingly didn't return to this manuscript or the idea of publishing its poems until after the dissipation of her writing block that led to numerous new short poems, which constitute the bulk of Fat Art, Thin Art, in which she wrote over the course of her psychotherapy with Shannon Van Wey, which she began after her initial bout with cancer. And this is recounted and described in A Dialogue on Love. A few brick walls materialized as I considered what I wanted to say about the Traceable, Salient, Thirsty manuscript today. As I set myself to think about what the return to Traceable meant for Sedgwick, it was clouded by the return I was undertaking. Not only coming back to Duke after some time away this year, spent researching and writing, but also getting back to work, re-encountering foundational motivations for writing, rubbing a current self against an earlier one, and refining both for the present, or how revision is embedded in life. A little over a year ago, having just come up for air after extruding a first dissertation chapter that left me more disoriented than when I started, I walked into the Rubenstein library to look through a few boxes from the Sedgwick papers that I had requested on a whim, though with deep interest, totally naive to what I would find. What I encountered and spent the next several weeks reading eagerly, exhilarated, and devastated on any given day I sat in the reading room totally reconfigured my frame of mind about my project. I'd found a series of folders containing hundreds of pages of email correspondence that read like an almost daily diary of a several-year period in Sedgwick's life from the early to mid-90s, which was a sort of precursor to A Dialogue on Love. And this was a window into her world at the time, beginning around the publication of Tendencies, through glimmers of insight that led into her later essays on critical method. And in that correspondence, she processed the therapy in which she was processing the lingering effects of her initial cancer treatment before the news of recurrence. She also described and processed the world in which her therapy was occurring. I caught a glimpse of the milieu of a rowdy first generation of queer studies students at a Duke that felt very far away from where I was in the present, but which occasionally shocked me with familiarity. And throughout, as Sedgwick maintained this diary-like correspondence about her therapy and her world, she wrote in sumptuous and granular detail about what the writing felt like to her, why she was doing it, why she ever wrote at all and wanted to keep writing despite everything that made it feel silly or impossible. She also wrote in this correspondence about her renewed attachments to poetry, framed by the therapy that sparked a profusion of poems for the first time in years, as well as her return to the poems in the Traceable manuscript she'd tried to publish almost 20 years earlier. I eventually stumbled across the manuscript with its typewritten pages in Cornell English department header while seeking out more context for that correspondence, which had become a sort of vital resource for me. It was a record of Sedgwick desperately trying to figure things out about her life and her writing at a time when I was also really trying to figure things out about my life and my writing. And I ended up writing a dissertation chapter about all of this. In the end, these encounters in the papers reoriented my thinking about how Sedgwick's creative pursuits informed the arc of her intellectual life, and especially the place of poetry in her later work. Now, at this point, I want to take a step back and paint a clearer picture of Sedgwick's relationship to the poems in this traceable manuscript, and what it meant for her to return to them when she published Fat Art, Thin Art. At one point in the diary-like correspondence I just mentioned, Sedgwick recounts a conversation she'd had with Ken Wissaker of Duke University Press, who'd recently given the go-ahead for Fat Art, Thin Art, which in 1994 would be the very first new poetry collection ever published by the press. Sedgwick writes that, and this is a direct quote, "It was nice talking with Ken, cavilling about Fat Art, Thin Art, and also making more vivid for him the sense of the frustrations and awfulness now in the past concerning the publication of the poetry. Now in the past," she emphasizes. So Sedgwick wants her current publisher to feel the abjection of having to resign her earlier poems to the drawer, these poems of Traceable, Salient, Thirsty, and others like the unfinished Warm Decembers. But also, in making him feel that objection, Sedgwick also wants to insist and to make him feel that it's gone, or that it's at least somewhere else, having been surpassed. It's now in the past. To persist through early career rejection, and not to mention the crushing pressures of the academic job market, it seems like some aspects of Sedgwick the poet had to be relegated to the past until certain desperate times called for a return to or reevaluation of these earlier creative measures. In the meantime, Sedgwick's criticism had found her an audience that she considered, quote, coherent, engaged, demanding and changing, highly queer, and highly interlocutory, which was a total transformation from the exiguous or meager relation she remembers surrounding her as a young poet. Holding the poems of the 1977 Traceable, Salient, Thirsty manuscript side by side with their slightly changed or often wholly preserved versions in Fat Art, Thin Art summons an image of Sedgwick doing something similar, inspecting the poems she associated with an isolation now in the past and scrutinizing their suitableness for her fuller, though perhaps just as disorienting present. The traceable manuscript contains 8 poems of varied length. Their titles are The Palimpsest, Everything Always Distracts, Sexual Hum, An Essay on the Picture Plane, Lost Letter, Poet, K, and Trace at 46. All but 2 of these, The Palimpsest and Lost Letter, made it into Fat Art, Thin Art. Those 2 went uncollected until 2017 with a publication of a critical volume called Bathroom Songs, addressing Sedgwick's work as a poet, edited by the scholar Jason Edwards. And the rest of my talk today, I want to make room to imagine the feelings of the writer behind these poems, who Sedgwick may have felt she'd outgrown, electing not to include those 2 poems in Fat Art, Thin Art. And I want to think about what that young poet wanted, maybe to be heard or recognized, to be seen in a certain way, to be seen as a certain kind of person. A person who commands a certain kind of respect or is able to preempt or retool shame. Sedgwick most explicitly voices these desires in her 1987 essay, A Poem is Being Written, where the lyric poem, unforgettably, is analogized to the body of the child and enjambment to spanking. Sedgwick imagines that the thrill of writing a line break arises from a protective, re-empowering gesture for the young poet Eve Kosofsky, who had occasionally been punished with a spank. Enjambment becomes, quote, a syntactic thigh or shank that would intercept the numbered blow and say no. Poetic writing continued to be Sedgwick's preferred means of intercepting blows and preempting diminishment. Notably, both of the poems from the unpublished traceable manuscript that Sedgwick ultimately excluded from Fat Art, Thin Art are among those put on display and anatomized in A Poem is Being Written. Her poem's own motivations and failures are metabolized in service of that essay's larger theoretical inquiry. And there, Sedgwick remembers one of the traceable poems, the long poem Lost Letter, a piece of which is the second image here. She remembers Lost Letter as, again, this is her speaking, the charged up work of a 24-year-old graduate student, never the most possible poem, whether to classify, to show, to publish, to secret, to address, or to throw away entirely. And that 24-year-old graduate student had been gripped by a perennial desperation to be seen as the right kind of person for the job of being a graduate student. The end of Lust's letter goes, "I've been reading an anthology of recent poets so as to sound in conversation like a poet, so as to get a job teaching young poets the scopophilic and exhibitionistic transports that are, no kidding, what make it beautiful." Now, I think anyone who's once been a young scholar might recognize in Sedgwick's anaphora of self-justifications the innocent graduate student's naive and earnest efforts to transform themselves, to inhabit a professional habitus or an academic identity. Another version of that graduate student maybe daydreams. If I just download all of these Foucault lectures, surely I'll become the kind of person who writes a publishable article. Sedgwick explores her longstanding, uncomfortable fit with academia more deeply in A Dialogue on Love, how she faltered in her oral exams at Yale, or how in early job interviews, when asked to describe her dissertation, she would sink into herself, quote, gazing off into space, murmuring, "Oh, it's complicated." The end of Lust's letter offers a clue about why it may have felt so impossible to speak. Quote, "I haven't found any other poems like this one, neither as risky nor as unnecessary. In fact, the fiercest of my love for these pages, all these pages, is the least oblique thing going here." For the young scholar Sedgwick, poetry was a foundational, still primary attachment that resisted translation into instrumental professional terms. Risky and unnecessary, that was the point. Poetry writing for Sedgwick was about those scopophilic and exhibitionistic transports, contained textual space to assume authority. As she later wrote in her correspondence, writing could feel at its best, and this is another direct quote, taking control over the relation of part objects in repetition to the overall narrative flow, getting to specify, despecify, and abruptly resituate my own point of view, getting to make the auditory phantasms appear and fade, getting to provide the context in which a particular act of naming or exposure will seem salient or violent or exciting. At the time these poems were written in the mid-70s, however, it seems like Sedgwick's motivation for producing critical writing beyond getting a job may not have yet been fully comprehensible to her. It was almost as if adopting a univocal critical stance or yoking herself instrumentally to an academic brand would do a sort of violence to poetry or to her attachment to it or to the child for whom it had been a singular lifeline. It took a series of professional failures and years of precarious academic employment before Sedgwick found the characteristic critical voice we know as such. Though her poetry had become blocked in the process, it could seem to us that Sedgwick found some sort of compromise or a way to funnel her poetic energy into the essays we know best for their scopophilic and exhibitionistic transports, for their performances of interiority and availability for identification that hail scholars to face down and make comprehensible their own motivations for writing. And by the time her poetry had returned in the mid-90s, Sedgwick's critical emphasis on writerly attachments of these kind had only intensified, from her full-scale reappraisals of the methods of critical cultural inquiry to the graduate seminars she taught on experimental critical writing. The beginning of this last stanza of Lust's letter outlines that interpretive stance, which is familiar, though not totally peculiar to poets. Last section of Lust's letter, not the last stanza. So it's the starts at the top of the section 9. Like the detective's gift or shrinks, the poet's gift is blank fatuity and no hint of anger, as if this resourceful immobility could, for more than a riveted instant, assuage the storms of anger that travel around poets. What the detective, shrink, and poet have in common, in short, seems to be something like commitment to the bit. The detective, shrink, and poet tune out noise. They suspend the desire for certainty or closure, allowing the ramifications of evidence, speech, or expression to unfurl. Unlike the detective, however, no one is waiting for the poet to solve a murder. Unlike the shrink, no one pays the poet to plumb the unconscious, though a good shrink or a sort of well-shrinked poet might make meaning out of that negation. Poets, in short, often have less solid pre-existing professional infrastructure to lean back on, and literary scholars are increasingly no stranger to this arrangement. What is the poet critic to do when it feels like no one is asking them to do it? For Sedgwick, from Traceable onward, part of the answer was making use of those storms of anger and insisting on the value of non-instrumental and poetic values. That meant for Sedgwick facilitating attunement to language and sharpening interpretive discernment, dislocating readers' habitual relation to forms of textual mastery, compelling deeper attention to how and why communities mobilize around objects of culture, and training attention on the life ways writing makes. So, in summary, I've turned our attention to the traceable, salient, thirsty manuscript to think about what it meant for Sedgwick herself to return to it, and to return to writing poetry at a moment of personal crisis and disciplinary upheaval in the 90s. As I prepared these remarks, I found myself wondering how the story of my own life spent around academia might be told as a story of evolving attachments to reading Sedgwick. And I've tried not to overburden you with that here, but I also know there are people in the room who understand that that sort of enabling identification is part of what reading Sedgwick often means. And in her papers, among these drafts and correspondences and life fragments, that effect is doubled. And these resources, I'm sure, will continue to provide the occasion to think about the entwinement of Sedgwick's theory and art in her life, and about the ways that we habitually relate to Sedgwick as a writer and figure in our fields, and how and why we continue to return to her work. And I'm looking forward to talking more with everyone. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for attending the Exhibit Roundtable panel. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. Thank you, Robyn, for facilitating it. I've been really excited about this portion for a while now, and I'm so excited to be here with Cole and Julien. Cole and I were in coursework together, which was wonderful, and my first GSF grad scholars colloquium I went to was Julien's, and so I've been admiring from afar for a long time. So for my archival object, I've selected Polyp, which is one of Sedgwick's textile-based art pieces, and it's displayed in the exhibition, as you've probably seen. It's a dyed textile piece containing printed text from Marcel Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time. And as its title suggests, as Polyp's title suggests, Polyp is designed to resemble a sea anemone or coral polyp. This piece was displayed as part of Sedgwick's 2005 exhibition, Works in Fiber, Paper, and Proust at Harvard University, which included other artists' books like the Loom book and the untitled Atmospheric Changes that are on view or displayed right now, as well as other textile-based pieces. So before jumping into kind of reading or thinking with this piece, I wanted to quickly kind of walk through its physical composition, which I guess is also a way of thinking with it. As you can see behind me, you have these long kind of strips / pieces of fabric, which are separate from each other, and I believe seem to invoke the tentacles of the polyp. And they're folded to converge and to create that kind of round knob in the center. There's a smaller piece of the dyed fabric that's tied and knotted around the fold, which helps also to give shape to the center part. And when it's displayed, some of those smaller pieces also sometimes give shape to the strips of fabric, depending on how you hold it. 5 of the strips of fabric have quotations from Proust, and those are mostly but not always knotted at the end. So sometimes there's kind of an easy way to distinguish them when you're looking at it. The fabric is silken. It's extremely lightweight, which means that when you're handling the piece, the strips are dynamic and movable. You're able to read it and move it around. And at the same time, the fabric holds these folds. There's a bending from what I think is from the dyeing, and the dye also visually kind of marks that folded pattern, as well as other folds, possibly from the way it was housed before, and then possibly as it's been when it was received by Rubenstein. It's been kept that way. And so if you look at Polyp in the exhibit, it's been displayed to show the quotations to the extent that you can, because often you're sacrificing other kind of strips when you lay it out. And also to kind of follow where the fabric wants to go, because this there's a physicality to it that kind of tells you what 2 strips can at this point be like read at the same time when left alone. It kind of moves you through itself. I selected Polyp today quite frankly, because I'm taken in by it. And it's kind of outside my comfort of close reading, which is more with written texts. I also primarily work with novels and historical documents, not as much with art history, visual studies, and I'm also not a Proust scholar. So thinking with Polyp is a little intimidating. But at the same time, I'm fascinated by it. And over the summer, when we'd been discussing an object from the exhibit to use to advertise the exhibition, we weren't really sure, and we're having a lot of conversations about it. And then once we selected Polyp, we almost immediately turned to it. It seemed almost like this natural answer that had been there the whole time. And in part, it's because it invokes Sedgwick's decades-long engagement with Proust, which was so generative. It invokes her textile work, which is one of the things we really wanted to make prominent in the exhibit. Nominally, and we'll return to this point later, Polyp also invokes the idea of polyp as a growth of tissue within a mucous membrane. And so as part of this exhibit is thinking about Sedgwick as a thinker of illness and mortality. I don't mean to force this connection, but I think an anomaly arises from this question of form and of surface in her work, and also the name of Polyp itself. And then all of these pieces seemed integral to Sedgwick's thinking as queerness as a sensibility, from Proust to the texture and affect. You can also see in Come As You Are, in White Glasses, in The Weather, and Proust. So in the time remaining, I want to think about Polyp in relation to two written pieces that may allow us a way kind of into the physical object. The first one is the titular essay of The Weather in Proust, which was first delivered as a lecture at the English Institute in 2004, and then as an expanded version with two parts was delivered on November 9th and 10th in 2005 at Harvard University in conjunction with her art show where Polyp was displayed. And then second, I also want to think with Jason Edwards' notion in Queer and Bookish, which looks at Sedgwick as a book artist, of Jason Edwards' notion of a spineless book, which is spine-less. So in her artist statement, which is excerpted on the Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick Foundation website, Sedgwick describes an overarching commitment of her exhibition, Works in Fiber, Paper, and Proust. Emerging from her extensive engagement with Proust novels In Search of Lost Time, Sedgwick writes that the art pieces, and I quote, are not meant either to illustrate the book or to evoke its time, place, or atmospheres. The show's title reflects my interest in using Proust's language and thought as a medium, one with texture and materiality comparable to other artistic media that can be manipulated through various processes to show new aspects. But if these are works in Proust, in the same sense they're in fiber or paper, they also reflect the transformative potential of a prolonged immersion in someone else's mental world, a way of being in Proust, end quote. With this statement of intention, Sedgwick distinguishes her project from that of representation, of kind of any illustration of the novel, as well as from a kind of historical contextualization of the novel. Similarly, in The Weather in Proust, Sedgwick identifies her interest in atmosphere and weather in Proust as a way of thinking about the relation between open and closed systems in Proust's thinking. To do so, she separates her project from a historicist one, which might try to bring Proust, and I'm quoting here, which might try to bring Proust into explicit relation with the science of chaos and complexity or with the science of his own day. Instead, Sedgwick aims, quote, to use these topics in contemplating some characteristically Proustian modes of being, of relation to self in the world, a kind of Proustian reality, she calls it, but it's also very much becomes a Proustian object relations. In The Weather in Proust, Sedgwick close readings elucidate these Proustian modes of being. They begin with the narrator's self-description as an animated barometer, and over the course of the essay, Sedgwick unfurls how Proust offers an alternative intersubjectivity, a different kind of object relation than that of a Freudian and Lacanian Oedipal sexuality, which depends on rivalry and kind of an impossible possession, as she sees that in the Oedipal triangle. And so there are kind of two ideas coming out. That the first is this idea that Sedgwick distinguishes is the object of the environment. And so this is this other object and object relations that shifts our attention towards climate. Judith Butler describes in their essay, Proust at the End, Sedgwick shifts attention from an edibly structured sexual sexuality of rivalry towards an economy on the changes in climate. And regarding this shift, Butler writes that at stake is not just a preference for one mode of attending the world over another, but a basic reordering of how we understand what is most fundamental to being a body in the world. And they continue, Sedgwick asks us to reconsider the theory of the drive, since one of the most fundamental biological strivings is indeed to breathe and to continue to breathe. And the second part of this essay is around, or this talk, is around Proust's mysticism, which Sedgwick says is not based in an esoteric or the occult, but rather, and I quote, on simple material metamorphoses as they are emulsified with language and meaning. The striking phrase, metamorphoses emulsified with language and meaning, Sedgwick only uses in her artist statement, but the Weather in Proust directs us to a list of all the words through which Proust invokes the air as a site of alchemical state change, which I'm thinking now back to Jane's talk of this kind of listing that starts happening. And with emulsion, Sedgwick invokes a kind of mechanical rather than chemical transformation, one which suspends that which cannot be mixed but holds them together in these art pieces. So with those kind of 2 points, back to Polyp. With her artwork, Sedgwick seems to work analogically, in which Proust's language and thought, perhaps Proust's modes of being, are comparable to an artistic medium. Artistic media can be manipulated through various processes to show new aspects, as perhaps close reading does to written text. The artwork, then, is a making tangible the texture and materiality of Proustian modes of being, forms of intersubjectivity, and object relations. And if it's being done through the artistic medium, I'm kind of interested in what kind of close reading the artwork is performing on these Proustian modes of being, and also I kind of want to move to this question of the object of the book more broadly. And so first, one such manipulation is foregrounding the poetics of Proust's language. This point probably should have been immediately apparent, but it took me a long time to come to it, and it was mostly creating the booklet of Proust quotes for the exhibit, in which the text of Polyp no longer felt like the quotations on Polyp when they were in prose form. They needed the kind of rendering that they are rendered on the page with new enjambments and line breaks to make sense of them, or to feel that kind of identification with them that's in the art piece. And so some of this change is perhaps due to the form of Polyp. There are only so many words and so small that you can go with stamping and also with the strips of fabric. But it's also the artistic medium, and for thinking of the artistic medium as a form of close reading that kind of produces this problem with the stamped textile page, enabling us to think about the poetics of Proust. Secondly, excerpted from the novels, the quotations focus on these atmospheric pressures, each of which seem to tap into what Sedgwick calls Proust's continuing access to a psychology of surprise and refreshment, as well as his nourishing relation to work. In one of the pages, there's a band of red sky above the sea is how the quote begins, and we move from this band of red sky into this image of the clear jelly over meat, and from there back into the sea, which is already cold and steel blue like a gray mullet, and then we move into, again, the sky is the same pink as the salmon, and then that moves the narrator into thinking about the food that we should presently be ordering at River Belle, and that reawakens the pleasure in going to dinner. And so there's this movement from what are sometimes like in aesthetics of the sublime with the sky and the ocean become something entirely else here and get tied to this sense of refreshment and nourishment that Weather in Proust is pulling out. Similarly, on another band, Sedgwick focuses in on, or this selection seems to focus in on the language, again, of fermenting, which is one of those alchemical words that gets pulled out in Weather in Proust, as well as also the sun that's scorching the sea, as well as this kind of shifting sea that's a mirror with the sky. And so there's all of this kind of rejuvenating and awe-inspiring relationship between the atmosphere, the narrator, and then also of a kind of nourishing, refreshed self. And so in that way, the piece seems to be pulling on some of those ideas, the weather improves, because it's all taken from the second volume, from In Search of Lost Time. And then kind of the third point is that I think there's a reworking of the novel form that happens in Polyp. And this is where I want to think with Jason Edwards' idea of spineless books. By spineless, Edward invokes two meanings. The first one is what he calls a literal sense of being without a central spinal column, which Edwards also kind of maps in relation to Sedgwick's cancer recurrence and the instability of her spine. And then secondly, there's also spines as, quote, in the sense of sharp pointed ridges as on a prickly pear or porcupine. One of the interesting things about polyp, and that I've learned now in learning about sea anemones and coral polyps, is that the coral polyps in particular are, they're not spiky, but they do sometimes have kind of a rigid calcium structure to them. And this polyp in particular is a different rendering of that. It is specifically a polyp that is focused on kind of the tentacle anemone spinelessness of this kind of like sea organism. And in addition with that, if we look at polyp, I think if we look at polyp as a kind of artist book, it is also one that is similarly playing with the ordering of the book. That you can read it, there's no clear backwards and forwards, there's no clear front and back. It's this movement that is what Edwards calls is some kind of new game-based, sequence-based, shape-based, and distribution-based opportunities that's beyond the scope of the book normally. Polyp has this similar kind of unbinding of Proust's already notoriously circuitous and wandering novel. For those unfamiliar, In Search of Lost Time is 7 volumes, and English translations are several thousand pages. And so what I'm curious is that while its knotted center kind of suggests a kind of ordering, the strands are movable, the quotes are excerpted from their context, there are empty strands that can interrupt your reading and change the kind of succession of quotes. And so there's this changing of this ability to read the book, which is also at the same time seemingly evoking the experience of reading In Search of Lost Time. And then the kind of next subpoint is that in The Weather in Proust, Sedgwick turns to the thinking of 20th century Hungarian-born psychoanalyst Michael Balint, who describes two forms of transferential relation. One that he describes as malignant, which he associates with Freudian transference. It's insatiable. And then there's another form, which is benign, which is the satiable kind of transference. Sedgwick works through Balint's theory and explains that benign transference is based around a different set of objects and object relations, namely one of the environment, in that the environment is a different object that, and she quotes Balint here, says that no action is expected from these primary objects or substances, yet they must be there and must, tacitly or explicitly, consent to be used. Otherwise, the patient cannot achieve any change. Without water, it is impossible to swim. Without earth, impossible to move on. With polyp, I'm interested, first, I think you can ask whether or not polyp is a benign polyp, or in what ways polyp is benign. Seems to be an appropriate question to ask this object. But secondly, I think, and this is kind of my last hypothesis, is that in terms of the book form, what kind of benign object is a book for the literary critic? And I think polyp possibly produces a moment of, with its fragility, which its ability to move, which its ability to not be the same object that will remain after you've read it in that ordering, that it raises the question or makes us aware of the way in which the book is the environment for thinking, or the environment that is like tacitly expected to be there, and it maybe puts that primary object in crisis in the same way that Proust at times explores the frustration and crisis of the air or the weather as an environment. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to Laura and Katie for inviting me to speak, to Robyn for facilitating, to all those whose work went into making today possible, to my fellow panelists, and to everyone here. Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick's A Dialogue on Love is a book about the impossibility of saying it all and the seduction of coming back again and again to try anyway. This is another way of saying that A Dialogue on Love is a book about that most singular encounter, which begins when a patient arrives with a demand that is returned to them, inverted, when another responds, "I am listening." Arriving at the office of psychologist Shannon Van Wey following her cancer diagnosis with a dual wish, the wish to be happier and the wish for someone else to shoulder a lot of agency in the matter of my happiness, Sedgwick opens her address to this mysterious and friendly other with a question about death and the possibility of receiving permission at last to stop. Yet inscribed in the pages of this book, amidst Eve's apparent eagerness to be told that she may stop, is a movement that seems interminable even after her death, a push on, to go on, to say more, to elaborate. A Dialogue on Love is a book about the delectable emptiness of wanting something you can't ever get, and about the excruciating pleasures to be found on the road of failing to get it. A Dialogue on Love is a book about love. Of all the objects I could have chosen from Eve Sedgwick's archive, I chose to speak about A Dialogue on Love without knowing what I would want to say about it in advance. Reading A Dialogue on Love feels to me like peering into a closed room, eyeball pressed against the cold metal keyhole, ears pricked and attentive and everything still, lest an unintended movement disturb the silence and arouse the suspicions of the room's inhabitants that they are, in fact, being watched and heard. It feels a bit like spying on someone else's dream. My own scopophilic identifications with this position of a curious and indulgent voyeur peering into Eve's private archive is no doubt associated, at least in part, with my own experience in Eve's archives. Nearly a decade ago, I was a bright-eyed, eager first-year Ph.D. student in the literature program here at Duke. I was saving it for later. This was years before the library opened Sedgwick's papers to the public, but in my position as Professor Robyn Wiegman's research assistant, I was granted access to 8 of the boxes that now comprise the exhibit, the materials that Sedgwick left in her office here at Duke, and my task was to try to catalog them. I feel compelled to admit that I failed to complete my task of trying to catalog Eve's things. But each week, I sat in the Rubenstein reading room, working my way through coffee-stained notes and syllabi, newspaper clippings faded and folding at the edges. I read postcards and letters, some quite personal and intimate, many of them mundane, the stuff of the day-to-day. I found Post-its with reminders and appointment times and titles of books, after-visit notes from doctors, flyers and advertisements for events, and drafts upon drafts upon drafts of writing. I caught whiffs of the everyday scraps that made up Eve's work life here. I fantasized a lot about what it would have been like to meet her. It felt so intimate, my hands inside the recesses of these material traces of someone I would never know, even as the textures of her words have shaped the fabric of my thought in ways I could never finally account for. Reading A Dialogue on Love feels a bit like that, except that the book is more curated and intended to be seen, touched, poked, and prodded. Even so, the intimacy of reading the thingness of Eve's private archive has been, at times, difficult to bear. You may have noticed my somewhat uneven shifts in referring to Sedgwick here by her last name and elsewhere by her first. In the Hebrew language, my own mother tongue, a first name is called a private name, and a last name is called a family name. In a dialogue on love, Eve weaves a private place for Eve within the family names that populate the pages of the book. This work of Eve weaving comes alive towards the book's end, when Eve begins to literally weave, her craftsmania, as she calls it, where she finds a vast pleasure. How to weave a place of one's own amidst the names handed down by the family. There are, in a dialogue on love, many accounts of the Kosofskys, mother Rita, father Leon, brother David, and sister Nina, 4 terms in which Eve is the odd fifth. And one could say, if one were so inclined to summarize, that a dialogue on love is dedicated in great part to Eve's attempts to articulate her place within this familial constellation, using Shannon as a vessel and as the scene of a familial and unfamiliar address. What it meant for Eve to be a daughter and a sister in the workings of her family is, in one important sense, the subject of this book and the subject of Eve's work with Shannon. And yet, as in every good therapeutic or analytic trajectory, there is another path that emerges, one that pushes the subject in question and prompts her to ask as to her place beyond the grammars traced in the confines of the familial spaces. Eve wrestles with this question in her sessions with Shannon, once quite literally so, when the two play a game in which they stand, plant their feet and bodies about a yard apart, press their hands together and push, each one trying to get the other's body to budge. Disquieted, she writes, by this tectonic shift in what I've presumed were the fixed zones of permission and prohibition, Eve, who after some time succeeds in budging him a little, fantasizes that this game has restored me to an adult size, specifically one in relation to the spectral figure of my fear and rage, which I've always associated with my father and his own rage, a figure who's abstract to me in the particular sense that it could never have occurred to me to resist or push back against him, or to wrestle him to a standstill or to anything else. That's from page 95. In this embodied enactment of a transferential play that pushes back against this never-before-articulated law of Eve's father, there is for Eve speech where there was once an absence, movement where there had only been a standstill. No, not even a standstill, but only silence. In the aftermath of the game, Shannon gives Eve a card on which he's written a note, his home phone number, so that she might take the note with her on her upcoming trip to Notre Dame. In a parapractic act so apt it could have been lifted straight from a textbook, Eve puts the card in her pants pocket, sort of forgets about it, takes it out later to look at it with pleasure, puts it back in the pocket, and suddenly thinks, gee, these pants are dirty. Since I'm leaving for Notre Dame at 7 a.m., if I'm going to wash them, it had better be this minute. So she washes the dirty pants and realizes, belatedly, the note with Shannon's number inscribed on it is inside the pocket of the pants, which are now tumbling around the washer. One would be hard-pressed to ignore the aggression embedded in this parapraxis of forgetting and the signifiers that accompany it, which speak to an urgency of destruction, erasure, a washing off of something dirty involving a note and a no. Against the backdrop of the game of push is another game, and this is a game that Eve plays with Shannon throughout the trajectory of a dialogue on love. A game in which she names and renames again acts of taking in and refusing, cherishing and destroying, putting in and taking out and putting back, and forgetting and losing and missing. To push him forward, she writes in a haiku, I'll have to be ready to move forward on him. Backward, forward. 4 words, 4 terms in which Eve is the odd fifth. Here, gone, fort, da. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud describes his grandson's now famous game, in which a child throws a reel tied to a string away from him until the reel disappears. Then he pulls it back in, cooing ooh as he throws it away, exclaiming da as he pulls it back in. In contrast with other psychoanalysts who draw on the fort da game to think through infantile object relations or the child's attempt to symbolize the comings and goings of the mother, Lacan's meditations on the Fort Da attend not to the loss or refinding of the real object of the real, nor the mastering of the presence or absence of the mother, but rather to the child's entry into the world of signification, in which a word begins to absent the thing, such that a new reality overlays. This reality is that of the symbolic, where language and speech are the building blocks of pleasure and of the drive in all of its excess. If the shockingly, perhaps even inappropriately physical game of push and pull between Eve and Shannon seems to mark a shift for Eve in the zones of permission and prohibition in the work, her subsequent parapraxis, which happens later that same day, speaks to another logic involving silence and speech, perhaps even a refusal. Don't push me. Let's keep things clean. If I'm going to wash them, it had better be this minute. I've lost your note. I will not call you. The dreamlike quality of a dialogue. Ooh. It was time to stop looking at it, I suppose. The dreamlike logic of a dialogue on love is engendered in part by its unusual style, whose abundant use of blank space has been the subject of much commentary about the book. Eve writes, "To notate our strange melody, I have some use for all the white space." Neither poetry nor prose, but a playful take on the Japanese genre of haibun, exemplified by a combination of the two, a dialogue on love has been classified as unclassifiable. It seems as though no categorization could fit Eve Sedgwick more than the category of neither nor. Dualism, after all, was always the antithesis of her work. The prose of the book is made up in part of Eve's own writing, which sometimes slips imperceptibility into speech, such that it is never really clear what parts were addressed to Shannon, what parts are for us, the reader, and this impossibility sits at the heart of the book's performance, in which dreams and fantasies, associations and asides, questions and wishes and memories are mixed up altogether. Interrupting Eve's own voice in the prose is the voice of Shannon, which is heard both in his verbal responses to Eve, which she transcribes, and in the form of patient notes, which he shared with Eve, a fact that doesn't cease to astonish me. And interspersed throughout the prose are, of course, Eve's many haikus. As I am reading a dialogue on love, surprised, I find that the rhythms of my own thoughts take shapes of haikus. In the workings of the haikus, one is brought back to the place of rules, the scene of a shift in permission and prohibition. Constraining the sayable, these rules make possible the emergence of a logic, one that seems often to register in the rhythmic and musical quality of speech shorn of its meaning, brought back into the materiality of the syllable, the beat, the echo, its repetition. Through an excessively rule-bound logic, another kind of meaning can emerge, one that would not have been possible to say in another form. Here one has entered the realm of language as evocation, in which the frame sets the stage for the emergence of an act that would in other forms remain unsayable. Eve, who both binds herself to and refuses the formal logic of the haiku, follows the rules at the same time as she plays every possible maneuver to transgress without altogether breaking them. In Eve's use of the haiku, words spill out before and after the cut of the poem's start and end, sentences that begin and continue with dashes and slashes and mark her entry into prose and back again to poem, shifting in and out of the space of the lyric, which functions less like an armor than an interruption, a reordering of the flows of her associative speech. If Eve's cancer diagnosis marks the book's primal scene, which stands as the opening of her address to Shannon, a question that structures the progression of the book regards a different place of loss, not only the loss of one's own life, but the loss of pieces of the body, hair, a breast, beloved friends, which signify not only the literal losses, but also a set of other questions about the body, sex, submission, and the difficulty of finding a place in the face of interminable loss. In its question about a mode of treatment that could give voice to one's own place, a dialogue on love is about the perpetual failure of finding the words to say the thing, the words that would transmit at last something truthful about the singular experience of what it's like to live in one's own body, subject to and of an economy of pleasures whose logic is as idiosyncratic and particular as it is enmeshed in rounds of shareable meanings, intimate and alien all at once. This impossibility doesn't stop. It goes on, insisting, not in spite of, but because it speaks of a relation that is missing, one that cannot be written, yet insists on a return, to go on, to say more, to try again, to say it otherwise. Meaning, its seemingly endless production slides interminably into more. And what animates the possibility of this return for more is love. Love, disguised as a love for Shannon, who has at his best a vessel, a conduit, for Eve to discover a love that is a love of her own symptom, the Eveness of Eve. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Do I know how to turn, is this on? Oh, it's already on, okay. Thank you so much. I'm gonna offer, as a way to open up a conversation, a hypothesis about the relationship between your three papers, okay? And I wanna see what you think. And I'm spurred by, to think this, by something that Katie said about Polyp, which was about questions to ask the object, I believe is what you said. And I'm just thinking about the relationship between how each of you are offering a different relation to the object, okay? Where Katie's project seems to be about the questions to ask the object. Cole's seems to be about the object's questions, especially the question, the object poses certain questions because of what no longer appears in the two different things. And Julien, I'm kind of thinking that, the object that you're talking about, the book, presents the impossibility of answers, right? So, because the object that asks questions also can carry its answers. Anyway, I'm just wondering about the relationship between sort of question and answer, the role that the object and each of you have a different, the object is appearing to be something different, even though they're different objects, obviously, but the object is appearing to be something different in each of your talks, and whether or not, and I'm sorry if that's too abstract, but I mean, I'm just wondering whether you all have any thoughts about how your object appears in the relation you take up to it in terms of the question of question and answer, or not. That's, yeah.
Okay. Oh, that is on. Yeah, I think that, well, that's a great question, but particularly for Polyp, and it maybe, it is, I feel like looking at it, it's one of those, I feel like I'm not entirely certain how to ask a question around, like that is kind of like the scene of encountering that object. For me, that is possibly more about my approach to it than maybe the object itself. But I also think that's maybe part of what this, now I'm thinking of like the shift from Cole from poetry to critical writing, but also that this shift from now critical writing and poetry into kind of the artwork also possibly poses, and also that it when shifting kind of out of this mode that seems almost like invited to come with, whether like there's some attachment to literature, to art, or to Proust, but the shift kind of stages the asking of the question maybe over again, for me, possibly.
Yeah, I was really taken by the idea of questions to ask the object, especially after Cole, the way that it does seem that for you, the object was posing the question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this totally gets to what you're saying, but I think for me, so much of just wrapping my head around what I was going to write for this talk was it felt like I was sort of returning to thinking about Sedgwick and my time in her papers after a long time of sort of working on other things, and then when I turned to engage the object, the way it was engaging was also through this idea of return, and that sort of is sort of contained in that object for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I'm not sure if my response will address the question
That would be
either.
perfectly Sedgwickian, because I'm raising the question of the impossibility also of, the question, but.
Yeah, I mean, the object that I chose is, I like the way that you framed it. It's an object, it's an impossible object, and it's also an object about impossibility, and it's an object that tries to play with an impossible question that doesn't have an answer.
Right.
And, it's interesting, when I was trying to choose what object I would write about, I thought that I would write about an object in the archive, and then I thought that writing about a text would somehow be easier, right? It was, this is familiar territory, right? I was really struck by what Adam Frank said earlier, which is that you found yourself having to buy a copy of a dialogue on love over and over again because you keep giving it away. There's a loss and a refinding of the object anew that your anecdote evoked for me, a kind of play of wanting to find it again and again in another form, maybe to hold it for the first time again.
Yeah, that's great. Do people in the audience, you have some questions? Yeah, Andrew?
This is a remarkable panel. Thank you, all three.
Can you all hear in the back? Should I? Does this come out? This way? I don't. Okay, yeah. It would be great if, since we're taping this, to make sure. And we can just pass that.
I was just thanking the panelists that this is remarkable. All three talks individually as well as collectively made me think about how the three of them are staging questions about Eve's relationship to the book itself. Mm-hmm. So, Colin, the book that wasn't published, the polyp as spineless because it's not bound, mm-hmm. A different kind of textuality that's not bookish, although has text in it. And of all things, the dialogue of love looks in this context like the most traditional concept of a book, which I hadn't ever imagined it before in this kind of company. So I wonder if you had any further thoughts about the book.
You can say no. Yeah. you can say, yeah, great question. Yeah.
Each one of these objects, it strikes me as a kind of experimentation with thinking about books in pieces, parts and pieces, fragments of books made and reshaped. And, there's something about the book that was never published, a book cut up, with just a few surfaces inscribed, right? And then this kind of trans-genre of a book. These are just some reflections on your question.
No, yeah, I don't have a ton to say, but I think for me, so much of it is just like what is so affecting about reading Sedgwick's criticism is how often sort of bare and apparent her own reflections on her motivations for writing, why she's undertaking the work, what is driving her to do it, right, in the first place. That I think when when it comes to, right, think about the books as individual pieces, you sort of find yourself in that frame. You want to, and that's sort of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I was thinking now about Butler's essay, which I reference, but Butler, they really pick up on, or kind of draw out of the quote around the kind of the objects of benign transference, around the survivability of the object, or that the object will survive you, and the way that works in this kind of other set of like environmental objects. And I think that's interesting in terms of the book, and also the book's relationship to the body, and also to the archive, but of all of these pieces, like the poetry that stays and frustrates and doesn't make it into the book, but then also still remains and survives that process, and then eventually goes into fat art, then our dialogue and love of like the patient notes, and the well, also, I mean, just formally dialogue and love, but just like what happens when psychotherapy, or like that exploration gets rendered into a book that has a different survivability than the life of the patient, which is who the psychotherapy is for, kind of question mark. But there's I don't know, I think there may be something. Yeah.
It seems related. There's something about the way that in a dialogue of love, on love, I always say of, that's so interesting, yeah, anyway, in a dialogue on love, by the end of the text, like the last, I don't know, maybe even 10 pages, it's mostly just Shannon's notes from their sessions, and it's that Sedgwick is then now much more, we're told, interested in doing the artwork, in the textiles, right, in the materiality, the material relation to ceramics, or to fabric, and this kind of, and so that it's interesting how the text itself, wears out the relationship to words and to almost to the formal structure of the book, because already, like as you see even on page 94, but even early on, that the poetry and prose are intermixed. We were talking in class yesterday about how the haiku form is, it's a container, right? As opposed to, like, we often think about, lyric free verse seems to be expressive, but haiku it contains, its rules rule you, as opposed to being, and she doesn't break those rules, but in the haiku form, but she breaks the rule between haiku and prose and stuff like that. So already you see the idea of the book in this text is being undone from the very beginning, and by the end, we know narratively that she's much more engaged with textile and with the materiality. Yeah, Adam has okay, Liz then Adam, yeah.
Yeah, and actually maybe Adam, what I'm about to say might kick in. I'm really struck by this anecdote about the first 8 boxes were left behind. So the first 8 boxes of the collection are trash. So I'm wondering if the 3 of you...
Not anymore.
Well, that's my question, right? Yeah. So your 3 papers were fantastic, but I'm interested in I don't know, negations, disavowals, refusals, just trash, just things that, not losses that the symbolic can take up again, that we academics can take up again, these losses, and do something with them, and you've all done something beautiful with them today. There's something about the archive that's murdering the wish to die.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Adam, do you want to? And so I was struck, Adam, at the end where you said, my contaminated love. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a contamination here in the archive with trash.
Wow. That's great. That's really interesting, yeah.
Are we stacking question?
Well, Yeah, we want to hear what he has to say.
Well, it's,
Follow that one up.
yeah, this is, I'm not sure how to connect what Liz just said with the thoughts that I was having when I was, no, but it might still be possible. I was thinking about how Eve's work seems to turn us inside out, and the polyp as a kind of almost exoskeletal work where the spine is rendered into just a binding at the top. So there's still a structure, but it's a much looser structure, and how the dialogue on love also requires that we peer through the keyhole, and then something happens in that relationship, and that the book that is never published poses problems for us. Or what is her question is, what is it that a literary text knows about us? You know, that kind of reversal of the object relation that we would critically seem to go towards. And again, I guess the archive seems to be reversing the trash value.
It's reversing the therapy, Liz is saying. Yeah, from,
Not totally, but
yeah.
isn't in some way the archiving, as any archive, is reversing, it's been minutes since I've read this, but isn't it reversing her wish to die?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot in a dialogue of love about the wish to die. And in fact, the last words, but she wants somebody, like as you were talking about, Julien, to take responsibility for her happiness, but actually she wants somebody to take responsibility for her death too, like that happy, you know. And so the last words are from a note by Shannon, by the therapist, that says that he's hearing her voice. Wait, it's something about he's in her.
Like a friend has called her, and he can hear.
He can hear her. He can hear himself in her voice. Or something.
She shares the idea that she can imagine hearing him tell her that it's okay to stop.
Right, and so the last sentences are, "It's okay to stop," right? So that it's then the permission to die, right? And there's a whole thread in that book about, you know, her. It's like suicidal ideation, what we would call that now, you know. Yeah, so. Did you want to, yeah. Other people?
Maybe.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, thank you both. I have a few kind of scattered thoughts in response to this that I'll see what to do with. I mean, for one thing, I think we can definitely think of those 8 boxes as trash. And in a way, I mean, should we be so lucky so as to, you know, refuse this refuse that falls away, and then, you know, it can be left. It can be left to make something else with it, right? And I mean, I was really interested in this formulation of murdering the wish to die. I wonder if it's, you know, Eve's wish that we're murdering, or like our wish for her to not die. So yeah. Yeah, and I mean, something else that I think is really interesting about A Dialogue on Love is that it's in the chapter before the last one that Eve takes to the couch. So the book ends, but in a sense, the analysis, if we could imagine that that's what unfolded, actually begins at the place where we stop reading. It's the 9th chapter, I believe, or the second to last chapter, where she begins lying down on the couch. She begins to free associate. Something has shifted in their work. And this is also the place where she begins to weave. And so what it is that she might have been given permission to stop may be reformulated. Maybe it's something else has stopped, and maybe something else begins, and, you know, maybe this is my wish to refuse her death.
This is
Somebody back there. Yeah. Go ahead with Katie while she gets over there.
I was gonna say, with kind of maybe like also adding on to the office files, because it's really fascinating what's in them, and the like Warm December's kind of journal manuscript in progress is in there. I think it's in box 4. But there's also this kind of, I mean, with that piece, it's like iterative over and over again, the same pages printed and rewritten and edited and rewritten. And then also with some of the art objects adding too, we've had a lot of discussions in kind of describing them of, there's this also kind of like expansion. The clay monoprints for one, there's a large number of them, or also with a lot of the glass beads and small art objects of how to describe them in comparison to some of the pieces that we knew were like finished and included in exposition, and kind of what do you do with, which she called like the kind of like immense crafting, and how do you talk about those objects and where they meant to last, which I think also come up.
Yeah, wow.
Just thinking about the idea of trash and wondering, about how Sedgwick felt about those boxes she left behind, right? Because, and I also think about the relationship between like trash and drafting, right? This sort of like refuse, all of the notes, the things that are excised, all of this, right? And in relation to dialogue on love too, right? The correspondence that I was talking about is this kind of like ungamely correspondence that sort of seemingly that she was engaged in, right, while she was in therapy, but that was later seemingly, I'm not exactly sure, but she seems to have printed out her side of the correspondence, like as she was writing dialogue, going back to that immense, very long correspondence, and sort of pulling from that to create the book that we receive as dialogue, and which really weirdly then does make dialogue seem like a more kind of contained entity and object than people often think of it, and I wonder. Yeah, I wonder about how she felt about leaving those behind. If she really wanted dialogue to be that sort of contained thing, and now we have this record that, I wonder. Yeah.
Can I say just one more quick thing about this question? Yeah, I mean, in thinking about the word trash, when I first heard you say that word, I thought of something, immediately forgot it, and now remembered it again, which is that my experience in those archives was I found so much smut in there, and like so much.
Smut.
And like pornographic stories, yeah. And, something about leaving something behind is, one could say that there's always a wish for someone else to look at it. Otherwise, I mean, you would have thrown it away, no?
There, and then Laura.
Yeah, I'll try to be a little bit coherent here, and a little bit very appreciative and a bit sentimental as well. What I heard in that question also brought me back to elements of a dialogue on love, and a lot of what I'm hearing happening today, kind of four terms: trash, supplement. There's one in the middle that I didn't quite catch, but in response to that question, someone said something about, one of you said something about the way academics not rescue, not repair, but something with that supplemental material. And then the fourth term I would say is repair, and thinking about this formulation and the talks today, I was also thinking about the scene in A Dialogue on Love that means a lot to me, which is the scene on 9th Street where, whichever direction it is, where Eve has stumbled in the bank parking lot and dislodged a clump of earth or something, and then later sees Shannon, not seeing her not seeing her impersonally, but also lovingly repair it. And I guess to turn this into a question, I'm curious how the panelists, even in the last hour, from this conversation from each other and others, what additional possibilities of loving academic modes of repair you might see since you wrote your talks for today. Thanks.
Am I right in remembering that in that scene, Eve is watching Shannon pick up some trash to throw away.
From the office, I think.
Uh-huh,
I think. Like she gets there before him or something. Yeah.
Yeah, that's Earth. That's Earth, but he's out throwing trash away, and then he sees that the Earth has, that where she stumbled, and he fixes it. Yeah, there's something about that. That's a tough one. Since we're getting close to time, and let's take Laura's question and then see.
Just a really quick comment from an archival perspective. Which
Yeah, you gotta push back on the trash there. Push back on it,
Word
Laura.
trash evoked a lot. in
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
I can
She's
tell you,
hiving up here, folks.
I can tell you that it was never trash. Not to us, for sure. I remember vividly opening those boxes and seeing what it was. And the last word in the world I would use is trash. But back in those days, which was a long time ago, we didn't keep as much voluminous documentation of every collection that came in the door as we have now. So a lot of it in our early days, many of us in the room know that, was to sort of put the puzzle together of how did this come here and what was the thought process of the creator. So that's what I meant in my brief remarks earlier, was to go to the creator. So I reached out to her, and she did not say much to me in those first emails. And so I was hoping, as one does in my position, to learn more when I met up with her. And after she asked me if I had tendencies, I asked her about those materials. And like any good archivist, I had prepared. I mean, I didn't catalog it to the extent that Julien did. I wouldn't have been able to talk about it the way that any of you today have. But I could speak like an archivist. I could say, these are the types of materials in the collection. This is what they look like. This is what they feel like. And I talked about Warm Decembers. I remember that vividly. And I remember her reacting and saying, well, I'm glad they're safe. I trust you. You'll know what to do. She was very brief. She was very, very, very kind. And I couldn't imagine why she would believe in me at that moment, because we only knew each other for a few minutes. But then we had a lovely conversation. And eventually, I met Hal. So I actually don't think she thought it was trash. I don't know exactly why she left it behind here, but I can say many faculty have done that, as I referenced. It happens. It's just one of those things that happens in those institutional transitions. But I get what you're saying about trash.
Right, yeah, I heard what Lisa said. If nobody has, we're almost at it, like there's like another minute or two left. Anybody have a comment or, because otherwise we will move on to our next thing. Thank you all so much for preparing so well.
Are you going to? It is. Okay, I think we've got like. Friends, I think we will start this final session. My name's Ranji Khanna. I'm in the English department in the literature program in gender, sexuality and feminist studies here. And I also direct the Franklin Humanities Institute. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Laura, Micham and Katie Carithers for inviting me to introduce Cindy Patton today. And since I have the floor, let me also thank them more generally for putting together this conference and for curating this exhibition. It's really been lovely. So it must be more than a coincidence and something of a curatorial gesture, I think, that a dialogue on love has been quite such a presence at this conference. A book that I would say myself that I love, even as I have learned a huge amount from so many of the writings. I do feel like I have learned from others, and I love this book. Last weekend, I had an experience somewhat like Adam's, actually, concerning his loss of the book. I swear I have at least 2 copies somewhere, but I could not for the life of me find one. And I've been wondering, too, if I have simply forgotten what the spine looked like, which has led me into another contemplations of spines of books, spines affected by cancer, and a sense of loss that is mine and not mine. I never had the privilege of meeting Eve Sedgwick, and indeed arrived as faculty in Duke's English department quite soon after her departure from it. And perhaps it is that relationship to her work that became marked by a loss to the collective, I suppose, that one understands under the singular category, the department, a loss that I feel has never really been articulated. But somehow maybe the loss absorbed itself into these books. They just keep disappearing. I went to look in the library, and strangely, the book is not there either. I wrote to Katie and to Laura and asked them, can it be possible that the library does not have a copy of this book? And Katie wrote back saying, indeed, she hadn't been able to find the book either, and had to get it from interlibrary loan. So it is a book that travels somewhere, obviously. It seems also that book has a life that is shaped by loss somewhat. Anyway, I have it now again, and I have read it with great enjoyment, and it was new again to me at this age rather than that when I read it before. I felt something different about the way Durham is mapped, for example, and also things like the shock encounter when you see your therapist getting on with their own life in the street or on a staircase, when they cease to be whoever, through transference, you imagine themselves to be that day, and they are strangers again. Which is all to say that I feel the absence of this person I have not met in the department and in the city, even as I have always thought of the earlier works as shaped too by someone before I have thought of as strangely present in my own imagination at Cornell and in Ithaca, New York, and absent for me at Duke and in Durham, North Carolina. And perhaps there we have something of a theory of the archive that is shaped by absence and loss as much as what we make of those gaps of which we are reminded, even as we're provided with more material that surprises us, with which we have a different tactile relationship. In Cindy Patton's very beautiful essay, Love Without the Obligation to Love, on a dialogue on love, she describes herself thus, in a sense denying the beauty of that essay. She writes, although Eve did a great deal to make me smarter, I turned out to think like a busted up social scientist. The bastard issue of qualitative empiricism and rhetorical deconstruction, a lost wild child from the literary turn in the social sciences, now past, I note with regret. I therefore leave it to the literary critics to say how a dialogue on love works as a text, and instead I open this particular iteration of Sedgwick's corpus to a socio-historical or historico-social reading, end quote. Patton reads Sedgwick with Pierre Bourdieu in her pocket to understand the relation of two affects. She writes, the first is a family feeling, a bodily nexus formed from within a power-laden field in which one is made to submit to the point of view of the family, and the second is what Bourdieu calls homology, or affinity of habituses, a recognition of the other that honors separations, comrade intimacy, coming together across difference, not in the humanist, transubstantialist identity politics walk in my shoes mode, but in the mode that experiences, in particularity, the structures in which we each differentially live our lives. It is also, of course, in conversation with Cindy Patton that Sedgwick, early in her essay, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, she writes in a way that draws us from one habitus to another, a conversation of a type so familiar to the habitus of the academic, in which, pre-modern-like, there is little separation between private and public, the form of intellectual life that emerges with friendship and familiarity, the casual conversation that actually changes the way you think about everything, but often doesn't emerge as a source, what seems like, as Sedgwick puts it, an unremarkable epiphany. She tells the story. This is Sedgwick. She tells the story. Sometime back in the middle of the first decade of the AIDS epidemic, I was picking the brains of a friend of mine, the activist scholar Cindy Patton, about the probable natural history of HIV. This was a time when speculation was ubiquitous about whether the virus had been deliberately engineered or spread, whether HIV represented a plot or experiment by the US military that had gotten out of control, or perhaps that was behaving exactly as it was meant to. After hearing a lot from her about the geography and economics of the global traffic in blood products, I finally, with some eagerness, asked Patton what she thought of these sinister rumors about the virus's origin. Quote, any of the early steps in its spread could have been either accidental or deliberate, she said, but I just have trouble getting interested in that. I mean, even suppose we were sure of every element of a conspiracy, that the lives of Africans and African Americans are worthless in the eyes of the United States, that gay men and drug users are held cheap where they aren't actively hated, that the military deliberately researches ways to kill non-combatants whom it whom it sees as enemies, that people in power look calmly on the likelihood of catastrophic environmental and population changes. Supposing we were ever so sure of all those things, what would we know that we don't know already? So she then continues, in the years since that conversation, I brooded a lot over this response from Patton. Aside from a certain congenial stony pessimism, I think what I found enabling about it is that it suggests the possibility of unpacking, of disentangling from their impacted and determined historical relation to each other, some of the separate elements of the intellectual baggage that many of us carry around under a label like the hermeneutic of suspicion. So often in their interchanges, we see also a question posed about what it is we understand language to be when we say it is not about communication, but rather all that is difficult to grasp in poesis. And yet even the congenial stony pessimist and the busted up social scientist seems in these encounters to work in different ways, and through this encounter to learn to live and to learn the wish to die. There is perhaps inevitability to that in the moment, in the world of HIV/AIDS, and then in the shadow of AIDS and cancer that the two were writing. Cindy Patton is the author, co-author, or editor of 11 books, including those early essential writings that helped us make sense of the world at a moment when it really didn't make sense. Sex and Germs, The Politics of AIDS, from 1985, Making It, A Woman's Guide to Sex in the Age of AIDS, with Janice Kelly from 87, Inventing AIDS, 1990, The Last Serve, Gendering the HIV Pandemic, from 1994. She's written on so many different topics, but I will mention that she has written on film, on ideas of passing in 1940s film, and in novels published as cinematic identities. She also has a book providing a cultural context for two early gay male porn films, LA Plays Itself, Boys in the Sand. In those works, we see her as an archival researcher, using the ideas of entangled history as a method. She has taught at Amherst, Temple, National Central University in Taiwan, Emory, and at Simon Fraser University. And the title of her talk today is Touching Legacy. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. That was very kind. I have to. I can either see my talk or you, and I'm afraid I have to see my talk at this point. Like everyone else today, I want to thank the many, many people who worked so hard to fulfill Eve's wish to have an archive of her writings, her completed and incomplete artworks. And these now are available to be used by others to make sense of the worlds that Eve occupied. Both the academic community and social movement actors have, over the past 40 or 50 years, had exciting and lively debates about the status and social use of archives, philosophical debates about historical memory and memorialization, prosaic cupcake fundraisers, and spare rooms full of boxes. Queers have been among the most active creators of archives and historical projects, not least because of the wholesale destruction of the Hirschfeld Institute in the 1930s, and the extreme limitations placed, still today, on the Kinsey Institute papers. The community-based lesbian and gay history projects that began in the 1970s have developed extensive collections of materials that once belonged to queers ordinary and famous. The value of archives, and especially archives that are orthogonal to the cultural tides, are something that we cannot take for granted in the current political climate. It's with some anxiety about our current cultural context that I offer these remarks today in a talk that I've decided to call Touching Legacy. It's in 4 parts. I'm just going to get this thing out of goes somewhere I don't. Some cavernous room at Amherst College, in the Octagon building, I think. It's 1986 or 87, and I'm watching the job talk of a sociologist applying for one of the first tenured positions in the new Women and Gender Studies program, a department whose name owed a great deal to Eve's influence, and to the presence of one Andy Parker, an equally important person in gender studies, but not a woman, obviously. I'm slightly appalled to suddenly realize that Eve doesn't understand what sociologists do, or maybe why they exist at all. Her pale, plump, classically elegant fingers draw a set of incrementally smaller boxes in the air. And then she fits her hands together as if she's holding a ball, such that her hands can't quite touch. And then she twists her wrists as if opening a spherical device. She says, "How do you see sex and gender fitting together?" A decade later, the same hands form ward off at the beginning of the Tai Chi form. The boxes are now more fluid, open, larger. They become parting the horse's mane. She was fascinated by Hal's extreme devotion to Tai Chi, and especially to push hands, a kind of battle in which the partners must maintain contact and yet separation, must follow each other's movements with great attention, but also with an intention to move to the logic of their own choreography, much like their relationship. Eve moved on from that set of movements to ones with a smaller range. The pale fingers filled the air with some kind of funny polymer clay stuff called Sculpey, which she molded onto votive glasses or maybe shot glasses until they were covered with carefully placed little round tokens of clay. The movements got larger again as Eve's arms moved across, pushing and pulling on several looms, like Tai Chi, movements that had been honed by others over millennia of practice, movements made sublimely efficient and specific to the individual through trial and error, and a few master classes. Eventually, the tiny movements of the Sculpey forming joined together with the sweeping movements of weaving as Eve combined the smooth polymerness of the clay and threads with varying degrees of roughness into objects that are, what, sculpture? Fabric? Texture is the thing. Texture makes visible what had been the space of air. Part 2, intellectual context. Ephemeral things left behind, expressive movements that unconsciously accompany thought, movements for movement's sake, movements that underlie the objects that more tangibly express a life, an intellect, a font of creativity. The physical materials collected in the files and boxes here will intermingle with yet other ephemeral movements as users of the archive shift and sort and realign according to their insights in academic disciplines. But this collective remembering, dismembering, disremembering, there was a context. There is a context. The intersecting academic and political debates of the 1980s and 90s. The thing that had been fought for to openly and officially and without threat of dismissal study homosexuality had, by Eve's arrival on the scene, become something fought over. On one axis, there was a battle between gay men and lesbians, whose different locations in the social world also gave them different locations within the academic structure. But on another axis, the battle was between academic fields. We could roughly say social sciences and humanities. Well, maybe not just two axes. Bourdieu was at that point, 84 and 89, busy arguing at length that academic fields are reproduced along with social class, and that entry into the higher capital spaces are also gendered, a descriptive project that Bridget Fowler continued in her work of the early 2000s. Together, this line of sociological analysis makes clear that the disciplines are themselves gendered, masculine and feminine, or perhaps better, as subfields in which possession of masculine capital results in better positioning. All of which meant that queering of the several academic fields, intertwined as it was with questions of gender, rolled out differently in the different academic departments that were already anxious about their location in the larger academic enterprise. A little accident of history suggests a concrete reason why the French theories, developed in the wake of the 1968 student uprisings there, were taken up differentially in Anglophone spaces like the American Academy. Although engaged in their own little gender wars, the French psychoanalytic and materialist feminists and their largely male French post-structuralist colleagues opened up for American academics and activists in parallel ways the potential of analytically separating acts from identities, bodies from desires. These works arrived first in departments of comparative literature, and for a very simple reason. American social scientists no longer read French. By the early 1970s, and certainly by 1988 when I entered my own Ph.D. program, social science programs in the US had, by policy decision, dropped the traditional requirement of reading knowledge of a foreign language, usually German or French, in favor of tool requirements, increasingly statistical and computer science-based methods of inquiry. Enter the Young Turks in the late 1970s and 1980s in literature and philosophy programs, those most effete of academic spaces, and thus anxious or soon to be made anxious by accusations of queerness. When they began deconstructing in the French mode, they could read French, whereas their brothers, and as women entered the masculine domains of history and sociology, their sisters, could not. Rather, these emerging scholars in the masculine domains had only second or third-hand access to the styles of thinking that had rocked literary studies, and much, much, much later, and often in very strange forms, became incorporated into the American social sciences. This was not independent of what was happening in the political awakenings of the 1960s and 1970s in the US, especially the emergence of gay liberation, itself awkwardly linked to the women's liberation movement, two social movements entangled with Black liberation and the Black civil rights movement. The history of theory developed at that intersection is less visibly entwined with the French invasion. Indeed, it was well into the era of queering that the significance of Frantz Fanon to French and American political thought was more clearly recognized within queer worlds through the work of Yale colleagues Diana Fuss and later Rod Ferguson. The accident of Fanon's death to leukemia at the age of 36 in December 1961, some 18 months after Eve Sedgwick was born in May 1950, obscures the fact that he was an age peer of the gentlemen we call the post-structuralists, several of whom also died young. Foucault in June 1984 of an HIV-related brain infection at the age of 57, Roland Barthes in March 1980 under the wheels of a laundry truck at the age of 64, Jean-Francois Lyotard in April 1988, Pierre Bourdieu, January 2002, Jacques Derrida, 2004, respectively, succumbed to leukemia and cancers in their early 70s, an age that once seemed old to me, but now not so very old. Eve was trained at Yale between 1971 and 1976, during the arrival of French theories into the critical scene that was dominated at that time by new criticism. a literary theory that Jane Gallup argues was particularly susceptible to the French craze because of a perceived similarity between the two traditions' reading styles. Eve started her career as these movements took up the canon debates, in fact, at Yale. She was trained by, or perhaps it's better to say she studied with, two prominent critics, Harold Bloom, defender of the canon, and Paul de Man, a generation older than Bloom, and one of the central importers of French and German criticism to the US. Audre Lorde died of cancer in 1992. She was 10 years younger than Fanon and 17 years older than Eve, and her life ran approximately the same length as Eve's. In 1984, I guess in the moment when Eve was readying Between Men for the publisher, Audre Lorde argued that you cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. But at least until queer theory was incorporated into the architecture of the master's house through queer hires and queer courses, this is precisely what Eve did. She took the tools of canon preservation advocated by Bloom and stripped off the wrapping. In the book that put her on the intellectual map, Eve deployed straight deconstruction to identify the homosociality at the heart of the canon and set into motion not only a brilliant career, but multiple tidal waves of extension of her meticulously accomplished revisioning of the cultural history of queerness, not as a hidden parallel universe, but as at the heart of Western productivity. Queer theory, as this method and philosophical framework was soon called, was here, and the dudes manning the barricades of the ivory tower had to get used to it. We all tried to stay true to our original kick-him-in-the-shins impulses, but we were plagued by the demand to believe in the university, even when the university did not believe in us. One had the sense in the culture wars then, and now again, that we were cannon fodder, or canon father. Patricide, that's the thing. Part 3, curating futurity. Eve's writing projects always seemed to exist in a disarray of paper piles. But her own collection and display of North Carolina pottery showed a strong eye for curation. And of course, there were the pandas. In fact, Eve was no stranger to the scary task of creating and then curating works based on an archive. She was no doubt influenced in her understanding of curation by her closest and most tenured friend from the Telluride years at Cornell, the exceptionally prolific Egyptologist Marcia Hill, curator emerita at New York City's Metropolitan Museum of Art. Growing middle-aged alongside Marcia, together with Eve's experiences of the death of many gay male friends early in the AIDS pandemic, what her friend, poet Michael Lynch called these waves of dying friends. And I'll just note, Michael Lynch was 6 years older than Eve. He died in July 1991 at the age of 46. These experiences led Eve to the project of pulling together the works of Gary Fischer. Eve met Gary Fischer when she had a teaching stint at Berkeley in 1987, and they incrementally became friends from opposite shores of that gulf called healthy and dying. And then for 3 years from the same shore, those years between Eve's diagnosis with breast cancer in 1991 and Gary's death from an AIDS-related complication in 1994, just a few years short of perhaps being saved by the so-called highly active combination therapies that became available in 1996. Across all their differences, visibly a cheery, large, barely middle-aged, presumptively straight white lady, and a 34-year-old, cranky, black, queer, 5'8", 140-pound man, their eventual parallel confrontations with deadly disease proved to be a strange meeting ground. She writes, this is from Gary in your pocket, I remember describing to Gary what I'd experienced as an overwhelming trauma of half a year of chemotherapy-induced baldness, a narcissistic insult, no medical significance whatsoever, but that had completely flooded my panic defenses, that for the whole duration of the treatment, almost every hour of consciousness had reminded me of an exhausting task. Gary said, yes, that's what it felt like for him to have KS lesions on his arms. No one else ever saw them. He always wore long-sleeve shirts. But alone, he said, in his apartment, he would spend hours, sometimes whole days, paralyzed in front of his mirror, incredulous, unable, but also unable to stop trying to constitute there a recognizable self. And Eve writes, impaled by the stigma. Eve may not have initially imagined the task of handling Gary's large collection of writing, most of it in drafts and notes and letters, because he was unwilling to put his work into the world during his lifetime. Eve's choices were meticulous, loving, and suffused with the ethical commitment to both the person and to the possibilities that the work left behind would remain open to new interpretations, would offer evidence to forge new historical connections. Sounding more like a historian than a literary critic, and even in this project in the mid-1990s, highly attuned to materiality, to the feel of the literal pen on an actual piece of paper, Eve explains her curatorial method. She writes, the material in this volume was chosen from the thousands of pages of notebooks and journals that Gary kept in longhand from high school on. Reading through this material, I felt grateful to whoever had taught him the handsome, legible cursive that fills the 11 massive, consecutively dated bound volumes, the couple dozen non-consecutive bound or spiral notebooks, and the hundreds of loose pages. She goes on, I wanted to assemble a characteristic, followable selection of this writing within a reasonable compass. Necessarily, the editorial hand here has been a good deal more active. In particular, while gaps within a paragraph are marked with bracketed ellipses, I have also freely omitted any amount of material that occurs between paragraphs, marked here with introductory dashes or ellipses. I've also changed all the names that occur in a sexual context. There are dozens of them, and virtually all of the people are unknown to me. I'm not struck with the desirability of maintaining a precise documentary dossier on anyone's sexual activity. And in particular, I can't know which of the people named here would experience such interpolation as extremely intrusive. No doubt some would not, but surely many would. Eve also includes a very manageable reading list of writing by and about Black gay men and about renegade sex for those unfamiliar with the historical context of Gary as a Black gay writer. The book then is both a gorgeous exposition of a very young writer's journals, essays, and correspondence, and a monument to Black queer history. Eve would have wanted us to also remember Don Belton, the close friend and colleague of Gary's, whom Eve asked to write the introduction. Barely 40 years old at the time, Don Belton was a rising star in the world of fiction writing, and one of the 1990s most important editors and commentators on Black gay men's writing. Don Belton was murdered in 2009 at the very end of the year in which Eve also died. Eve was 6 years older than Don, who was 6 years older than Gary. Like the much younger, much more peripatetic Gary, Eve didn't throw away very much, but there are many objects that were touched by her hands that are, at present, in the hands of others. I've been a bit obsessed with her early foray into clay, especially the pieces Eve made for fun or distraction before she took her artwork seriously. I remember arriving at her Durham home for Thanksgiving one year to find that many of the teetering piles of papers that had covered the surfaces of her Frank Lloyd Wright-style open-plan living room had been replaced with trays of clay blobs in varying states of molding. I remember her gesturing toward this sea of small sculpies and saying, "Take one." I was unsure if I was receiving a gift or helping her create more space. Certainly at the time, I had no sense of the object as a piece of Eve. Of course, these are objects that can now be cataloged as early works of Eve's art, which took many experimental forms, as we've seen in the exhibit here. For the people who've hung on to these casually given small homemade objects for 25 or 30 years, well, what the object means changes, or perhaps better, the objects take on meaning. The sculptures that remain are talisman, lieu de mémoire. I know the archiving impulse, and I also know the downsizing impulse. Somewhere between those two desires to manage the flotsam and jetsam of our lives lies the possibility that not everything is present in the archive, and that not everything in the archive is fully present, because they're related to objects of all kinds that remain in the hands of people who knew Eve. Last fall, I asked Hal whether I should try to find the sculptures and get them included in the archive here, and he said to me, she wanted people to have them, so they should remain where they are. The presence of presence, that's the thing. Part 4, remembering to forget less often. Eve was very disappointed to discover that I had never read Remembrance of Things Past. It's so long, I said. I'm intimidated to even start. Oh, that's not a problem, she replied. I just take a razor and I cut them into smaller pieces, as she brandished a thin example between her thumb and forefingers. I was shocked to discover that you could slice up a book at will. That must have been around 1990, a kind of high watermark of intellectual community when feminist, gay and lesbian, and especially AIDS politics yielded locally and bodily produced knowledge and critique that was at the margin of, but never really of, the institution. Douglas Crimp and Simon Watney were charging around without benefit of Ph.D.s, although Douglas finally got his. Eve especially loved the wonderful entangled flames between her work and that of Craig Owens, because his work, which used her work, which used his work, seemed for a moment to reach importantly into the world of AIDS activism. To question the link between radical thought and academic criticism and the street practices we had engaged in, or even just cheered on, had an unthinkable ramification for the whole project of queer theory. If there was no easy ford across the river of intellectual production, then her, our, and a whole bunch of other people's effort to create queer space here, to create space here, ... The struggle for position in the educational field that sometimes conveyed capital threatened at every moment to collapse back onto the object, the queer. The secret dark fear was that all of this work might simply result in nothing more than a better dressed cocktail party at the MLA. Eve suggests this possibility in the introduction to her 1993 volume Tendencies, where she issued this warning about queer ephemerality, the potential mortality of the project itself. More than 30 years ago, a little bit before Gary died, she wrote, I suppose this must be called the moment of queer, though it's other moments too. Right now, the moment just before the inauguration of an ostentatiously heterosexual president, i.e. Bill Clinton, who makes an audible, persistent claim to support lesbian and gay rights. Long moment of a deadly silence that means AIDS drugs we've been struggling to hold out for are just not in the pipeline. Think a bit about COVID. When Melvin Dixon and Tom Yingling disappeared from us, and Audre Lorde. When for the first time the New York Pride March had massive participation by African Americans and Latinos. When people organized around claiming the label bisexual or the right to be lesbian and gay soldiers, or the right to have their children not protected against HIV transmission. In the short half-life of the American marketplace, she writes, maybe the queer moment, if it is here today, will for that very reason be gone tomorrow. But I mean the essays collected in this book to make, cumulatively, stubbornly, a counterclaim against that obsolescence, a claim that something about queer is inextinguishable. Queer is a continuing moment, movement, motive, recurrent, eddying, tremblant. She ends this by linking a sensation and a judgment. It feels queer and good. In these words, she tries to ward off by acknowledging the possibility that what is now may pass into obscurity. Martial arts meets Austen, jail, not Jane. As if by predicting loss, its mode and its moment, the being queerness will not finally or fully slip away. A foretold loss made into a slight save because memorialized before the passing. Proust writes brilliantly of the power of the unexpected object to ignite the process of reconstruction. In tension with Proust, Lyotard argues that memory is not a substance that can be surfaced even fleetingly, and he emphasizes the inescapability of forgetting. For him, objects and rituals can't really function to help ourselves remember. So he de-emphasizes the quest to remember in favor of a quest to forget less often, or to remember to forget less often, not forgetting to forget less often. Sliced up pieces of remembrance of things past. Don't forget to forget less often. That's the thing.
I just want to say thank you to Cindy and to Ranji and to all of our wonderful speakers today. So join me in thanking them again. And I want to invite you all to a reception, which is where you found your coffee and where you found your lunch. Thank you, everyone.